Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is The Moon's Tears in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 16, Abditori. X. The sound of clanging and smashing echoed around the room. Ichigo paused, hunched over with a hammer in hand in an attempt to hit the nail which was at the moment eluding him. Kisuke's mint green eyes connected with Ichigo from across the small stretch of the lab they had claimed this evening. Ichigo's lips tilted upwards, faintly content with the silent companionship. Shaking himself, Ichigo looked back to the floor where their most recent project lay in a mess that they were valiantly trying to assemble. Shrugging off amused curiosity, Ichigo picked up the hammer and began again. Ichigo, have you noticed the sudden influx of souls in Rungokai? Ichigo looked up once more to tilt his head curiously in thought, recalling the Shiba dinner not too many nights ago. He nodded and replied, Kukeka was mentioning it. Seems many of them are being pushed to the outer districts. Kisuke frowned and heaved himself from the floor, muttering under his breath as the scientist was wont to do and running a hand through wheat-colored strands. Kisuke strode over to one of his desks, a mess of paperwork with more than a few jars holding dubious contents that glowed in the eerie lighting of the lab. He shuffled in a manic manner through the stacks, shoving files off the desk to join other such cluster. Emerging with a triumphant smile, Kisuke held a folder colored midnight blue in his hands. Ichigo shook his head in fond amusement at the genius antics. He turned his attention back to their latest project and waited for Kisuke to return to his previous spot. Kisuke settled down with a few pops and cracks from his protesting joints. Placing the file on his lap, he carelessly began to flip through it as the sound of metal being struck filled the room for a moment. Looking up, Ichigo set the hammer down. Seeing Kisuke's eyes alight with excitement, he waved a few pieces of paper in front of Ichigo's eyes at a speed he could hardly comprehend the colorful imagery. That's just what's being seen. You see, I developed a machine that tracks the general flow of souls entering Soul Society. The flow has been regular for the most part. The points where we seek peaks or drops vary. Often a peak indicates a conflict within or outside Japan's borders. People lose their lives in greater numbers and we see a surplus. The interesting factor is a drop in the flow. We chalk that up to developments in the modern world of medicine or of social and economic standing. Meaning people live longer or have better living standards. The thing that strikes me about this surplus is it's the greatest we've seen yet, and the souls are different too. Ichigo arched an eyebrow at Kisuke's words, wondering what the scientist meant when he mentioned the souls being different. He understood well the rest of Kisuke's message. The captain with a penchant for dramatics wiggled his eyebrows teasingly and scanned the paper, supposedly confirming his thoughts before he continued. Many of the souls were fighting in a war, and they called it the Great War. We are not sure if the time between the mortal world and Soul Society has fluctuated again, but we can assume there was a war of devastating proportions. The soldiers all show hints of Reisu, which is not uncommon to see in soldiers, as their life encouraged the increase or growth of Reisu in the soul. However, the men are haunted and often jaded and prejudiced against an unknown foe. That is what our surveys have shown, at least. You mentioned time fluctuations? Does that happen often in Soul Society? And if they have such power already, why hasn't it been brought to the attention of the Suteiko? Ichigo asked, his mind trying to process the information given to him. He had the inkling of an idea of what this great war was, and the thought frightened him slightly. Already they were drawing close to the main event, the catalyst for where everything would start. Kisuke frowned, staring into Ichigo's eyes, assessing whatever he saw in caramel orbs. The man sighed and said, time fluctuations usually happen in the case of souls crossing over. Occasionally the soul can die in 1 year, for example the Meiji era, and yet appear in Soul Society now. They seem to lose their way, or the best way to put it is stumble. Usually it's only a few years margin, but we've seen greater. The reason it hasn't been brought to the Suteiko's attention, or anyone for the matter, is that they're trying to keep it under wraps. They being Central 46 the usual culprits, and they're using the Onmitsukido as their tools. They see this information as useless, or at least that's the garble they spouted when I brought the matter to their attention. I've heard about the plans you proposed for a militia of sorts in Rungokai. It seems they have as well. All these soldiers may not wield enough power to become Shinigami, but the idea of defending Soul Society and being paid is likely promising. Central 46 sees this, of course. They're trying to weaken our ranks as they have been for years. They want the noble system to stay in place and for the poor Rungokai residents to be suppressed. The problem of the matter is, if those men are left there, they may use their strength for malicious deeds and we would have no way of reaching them. The outer districts would sink lower and the corruption would spread. It's what they want though, it gives them power. Ichigo sat back to stare contemplatively ahead, his mind processing the words spoken, turning them over in his head. The Central 46 had always been bastards intent on withholding change in the world, slowing their progress to a crawl. They were greedy, senile old fools who wanted to gain power, and to do so they had to strip some from the Shinigami. It was the one thing Ichigo did not lament or aggrieve Aizen for doing when he had murdered the old fools. The mention of time fluctuations banged inside Ichigo's head, also demanding attention. It did not explain Ichigo's own predicament. He believed his situation was more connected with the Danga precipice, but all the research he had done proved the theory wrong. Forcing his attention to Kisuke, who was staring at Ichigo, assessing and thoughtful, Ichigo answered, "If this is true, then what can we do about it? I can bring it to the Suteiko's attention, but the problem is overriding Central 46. Kisuke nodded. The scientist had likely already plotted all avenues open to him, and the options seemed dark in his mind. The man sighed, running a hand once more through golden locks before he said, "That's not the worst of the matter." Here the man pulled out a few sheets of paper filled with charts and cramped handwriting, shoving them into Ichigo's laps. The man continued as Ichigo's eyes remained glued to the sheets, analyzing the data. "I've only mentioned the soldiers. There's also the innocents, women, children, and the elderly. Most of them are frightened and traumatized, but there are less of them in comparison." Word is heavy on the soldiers' tongues, though, that tension was brewing and the war has only just begun. "I want to see for myself what they mean when they say that the sky is cloaked in poison, or the ground marred with holes. I fear, though, that I would recoil from what I see." Ichigo stood up, looking the charts over with a frown. He placed them down and began pacing around the room for a moment, head tipped back in thought. It was only beginning the First World War. This meant the timelines were already shifting. Taking a deep breath, Ichigo considered the information before rounding on Kisuke to pierce the man with a stare full of curiosity. He asked, "What do you plan to do?" The man raised an eyebrow, surprise flashing across his face before his mask rose up to cover the fleeting emotion. Kisuke shrugged, his own gaze bearing heavily into Ichigo's. Releasing the tense cast to his shoulders, the scientist looked down at the stack sitting in his lap and said, "Me? I don't know how to do anything of that sort. Why they made me a captain I'll never know. Look at what I've done, turned it into a science division. But do I govern and command my subordinates? Hardly. That type of action is suited to you, Ichigo. However much you attempt to deny it, you have a hero's complex." Ichigo stared at the man, baffled for a moment before a sliver of annoyance and acceptance threaded his being. Ichigo acknowledged his hero complex. It was what led him to act as he did, but he didn't need the scientist pointing it out. Shaking his head, Ichigo asserted, "They choose a fine candidate. Look at what you've accomplished. You turned this division around, made it special, made sure it contributed to the whole of Soul Society. Look what you've discovered because of this: greater lengths of Reisu manipulation, theories on the Danga precipice, studies of the anatomy of hollows. As much as you think you are not a captain to them, you are. They look upon you with respect because you take the time to explain complex theories to them so they can further their work. You show up to training sessions and you never force them to be more than they are, only embrace it." Kisuke stared at Ichigo in wide-eyed shock, trying to process the speech that had burst forth from the Orangette's lips and stolen the breath from Kisuke's lungs. Ichigo, no matter how much he wanted to deny it and hide from the limelight, was a natural leader with easy charisma that drew you in and forced you to like him and follow his ideals, and a strength that came not only from his power, extensive as it was, but his heart. "Thank you, Ichigo." The lieutenant blushed slightly at the thanks and turned away for a moment before uttering a soft "You're welcome." Kisuke stared for a moment more before standing up. He strode to his desk and collected a relatively blank piece of paper. "How about you continue working and we'll discuss a plan?" Ichigo stared unapprovingly when Kisuke mentioned Ichigo continuing the work, but shrugged aside minimal irritation and crouched down to begin tinkering with the object once more. They settled into a soft lull as both men thought the situation over in their minds, trying to process all the information and devise a capable plan. "I can bring this to the Suteiko's attention, show him the results. It would be your job to assemble the data into something coherent rather than your normal chicken scratch. We need to assemble what information we're bringing to attention and devise a strategy to deal with the influx. It could also help if we brought Central 46's treachery and planning to light, though we have no concrete evidence. He likely suspects as much. We then bring it in front of the senile bastards with the backing of the Suteiko and a plan and force it down their throats. If that doesn't work, we enlist outside help." Kisuk looked petulant about the incoming workload mentioned in Ichigo's words, though sharp determination cut through pale green eyes. A smirk grew upon his face as Ichigo mentioned the evidence and only grew wider at Ichigo's nicknames for the members of Central 46. Kisuk made some quick jot notes, eyes flickering up every few seconds to assess Ichigo before flickering back to the page already lined with Kisuk's messy script. Turning his attention back to their project, Ichigo continued to work, listening absently to the shuffling of paper and waiting for Kisuk's response. What they were planning set fire to Ichigo's blood and sparked excitement in his heart. If their plan was successful, they would be taking a step closer in the right direction. By reinforcing Rungokai, they would help to protect against future invasions and broaden their ranks, as souls with high Reisu would be unable to remain under the radar. They also achieved the more than satisfactory deal of reducing the senile old fool's power to near naught, giving Soul Society the chance to advance. It was likely they were the ones halting many of Kisuk's already magnificent inventions. Why haven't they promoted you yet? Anyway, your plan sounds good, Ichigo. I will assemble the information to the best and neatest of my ability. When are you meeting with Yamamoto? Ichigo snorted at Kisuk's unsubtle and near-silent question before he tilted his head to the side, mentally going through his calendar. He turned briefly and responded, sometime 2 weeks from now. He's a busy man, the Suteiko, and calls me when he's available. Kisuk nodded, letting out an amused snort, and placed his paper down. Standing up with a tired sigh, he settled opposite Ichigo and they began to work together once more. A soft humming filled his mind, Ichigo experienced often when he read or worked on something simple and methodical. Relaxing in easy and relative movements, Ichigo's mind wandered as his hands moved. Side by side they continued to work for another half hour, only the faint sun trickling through half-closed blinds and candles strewn in small clusters providing light for their work. It was this Ichigo missed, the easy companionship, the ability to sit without speaking yet feeling connected and content. There was a sense of gain even without speaking, as if each other's presence helped heal or influence the other. Have I ever mentioned the theory I had correlating Reisu and the human study of matter? Ichigo cocked his head curiously before shaking it, flaming locks swaying with the movement. Light shone in Kisuk's eyes, and as they continued to work he began to talk. My theory is based on what we consider matter. Matter in the human realm serves as the building blocks for all things. In Soul Society, Reisu serves the same purpose. I was wondering if, like matter, it is made of smaller particles and whether we can control them or not. The mortal realm is far more advanced in their technology compared to Soul Society, and only recently are we beginning to catch up, even as they began racing ahead again. Ichigo pondered the theory for a moment. Such thoughts seemed beyond him at the moment, but the idea had merit. Kisuk smiled at the slight peak of understanding in warm chocolate eyes before he looked at their project in sudden realization. It's finished? Ichigo looked down, surprised as well, before with a slightly sardonic smile and perhaps more snark than was necessary asked, perhaps now you could tell me why we are building a table. If Kisuk had a fan, the scientist would surely be fluttering it in front of his face in that vague and mysterious manner that always annoyed Ichigo, however fractional. Ichigo snorted, an eyebrow raised in exasperation, and the scientist smirked. Ichigo laughed, however, softly, and before Kisuk could regain control of himself the two were cackling like a pair of witches. Well, you see, I needed a place to put my new invention. Kisuk sing-songed after finally settling the laughter that had viciously shaken him. His cheeks were still painted rose from the force, and bright mirth hung in his eyes. Ichigo frowned, though it was not in anger, merely disapproving and yet teasing. And you couldn't have cleared off the 3 other tables you keep in this cluttered dank room? Kisuk feigned mock hurt, his hand coming to rest on his chest as he gasped in fake indignation. Ichigo shook his head and restrained himself from laughing by turning his head to look at the far wall where a diagram displayed the complex inner workings of the human figure. Mo, Ichigo, so mean. Kisuk pouted and whined. Ichigo turned back to the scientist, who was acting like a petulant child, and arched an eyebrow in exasperation. The man's playful demeanor fell away, leaving a soft smile on sharp features. A smile akin to Kisuk's own settled on Ichigo's features. Together they lifted the table and slid it across the floor. It protested the movement in loud screeches and groans as it was pushed against the far wall. Panting for a spare second, the two stepped back and regarded their work. The table remained standing, and Ichigo counted that a win in his book, even if the structure didn't look the most stable thing in the room. Then again, Ichigo was far from stable himself, so who was he to complain? Think you can spare me an hour more of your time? Kisuk queried, turning to face Ichigo, his hands still firmly poised on his hips. Ichigo considered the dying light and the spreading shadows. He was thankful he didn't have a curfew and Kukeiko's wrath wouldn't be too severe as he nodded. Kisuke beamed like a child told they were receiving a puppy, and there was a certain bounce in his step as he said, "Good, I want to show you my latest project." The man began to walk out of the room, impatiently glancing behind himself to ascertain that Ichigo was indeed following. Shaking his head in fond amusement, Ichigo followed Kisuke as he led him deeper into the lab. The 12th division by now was a patchwork labyrinth of dividing rooms and endless hallways, and Ichigo doubted he would ever find his way out if he found himself lost inside the maze. Fluorescent lightning, a more modern design sustained by Reisu, flickered overhead, only adding to the already creepy aura of the place. Kisuke plowed on unaffected, walking with ease and comfort Ichigo didn't bother trying to mimic. The room Kisuke stopped at was sealed by a door of heavy wood and bound with Kido and Hado 3 feet thick. The familiar pulse of energy from within the room sent apprehension coiling inside Ichigo's gut. Kisuke turned to Ichigo, assessing the young lieutenant for a moment before he said, "This is where I perform and create my less than legal or entirely safe projects. Do I have your secrecy that what you see in this room remains private?" Ichigo nodded without hesitation, and the serious demeanor darkening green eyes disappeared. Kisuke turned around, pulled a key hidden somewhere in the fold of his shiakusho, likely his sleeves with the man's habits. The lock clicked twice before, with a groaning squeak, the door was popped open, pulling out a smooth stone like one might find by a swiftly running stream. Kisuke held the object to the wards surrounding the room and they fell away. Following Kisuke inside, Ichigo felt a course through him. The room was small and circular, with half-finished metal contraptions sprawled in some corners looking like modern pieces of art. Other projects remained enclosed in cases of a thick material that seemed to suck in a light, or scattered on tables and under microscopes. Kisuke barreled forward after taking a quiet moment to indulge in the awe splayed across Ichigo's features. Shaking himself from his stupor, Ichigo followed Kisuke as the man led him to the very back of the room, where underneath numerous wards a box rested. It was simple and cloaked in the same materials as the others, with the ability to steal light and covet it. Kisuke bent forward, whispering a few words to the box before, with the grinding hum of gears turning, the lid popped open. An indigo haze seemed to bounce upon the sides of the box and reach out for Ichigo. Drawing in a sharp breath, Ichigo peered inside to see a pool of liquid purple in color, though shimmering with silver and other iridescent colors. "It's not even close to finished. This is what one of my main projects has been, that and the machine to process souls and Reisu. What do you think?" Ichigo stared, his eyes tracing the box and then darting up to glance into Kisuke's hopeful eyes. Closing his mouth, which had fallen open in the course of his amazement, Ichigo coughed and replied, "Kisuke, that's amazing. What does it do?" A nervous and uncertain laugh followed Ichigo's questions, and the scientist in question rubbed the back of his head before saying, "I'm not entirely sure. I've been testing its reactions with Reisu so far. The results vary and are hardly the same." Ichigo nodded, trying to process what was in front of him. Kisuke smiled and closed the lid, the aura of power and mystery disappearing as the lavender light was cloaked in darkness once more. Kisuke looked up after whispering the words or something of the sort to the box and said, "Now come, I didn't invite you down here to stare at a box of glowing liquid. Perhaps you can help me with some of the mechanical aspects." Ichigo smiled and nodded, chocolate eyes connecting with Kisuke's own pale green ones. A smile mirrored on both their faces as Kisuke put the project in its rightful place, and they moved off to one corner where a heap of metal and wires were coiled around stone. Raising an eyebrow at the scientist, Kisuke only shrugged unapologetically and bent down to begin working on whatever had caught his fancy at the time he began this endeavor. Following suit, Ichigo settled into the easy manic motions of helping the scientist, all the while his mind frothed with uncertainty and soon settled under the gentle hum of his movements. The bar was busy, far more so than Ichigo would expect on a Tuesday night. Rolling his shoulders, Ichigo questioned why he had ever agreed to come, knowing Byakuya wouldn't likely show up. It had been a spur-of-the-moment plan, and neither knew if the other was working. It seemed time had slipped from their fingers like grains of sand. The potent scent of alcohol hit Ichigo's senses first as he slid open the shoji door, a faded yellow in color that spoke of long use. The next was the sound, the roaring and heaving singing of the drunk, and the accompanying sound of clayware breaking. Sliding inside, Ichigo sequestered himself in the shadows for a moment, letting tangerine strands fall forward to shade his view. Grasping the pommel of Zanjutsu at his side, Ichigo glanced around the room warily. Feeling his senses calm slightly even as they sparked upon familiar Reisu, Ichigo heaved himself from the shadows and strode forward across worn hardwood floors that had seen the solace of too many feet. A waitress bustled up to him, a pleasant smile welcoming and honest on a soft-featured face. Her outfit was a pale yellow with faded stripes of juniper tracing the sides. Smiling in return, the woman straightened minutely and took another step forward, a stack of menus balanced precociously in her hands. "Hey Ichigo." Whipping his head around in partial surprise, Ichigo spotted Shinji accompanied by a few other captains. It was not Shinji's presence that surprised Ichigo, as when his Reisu first inspected the room it had alighted upon the small gathering. What surprised Ichigo was Shinji calling out to the Oranget and even noticing his presence among the frothing mass of Reisu curled about the room. Heaving a world-weary sigh, Ichigo tilted his head and smiled apologetically at the young waitress before he began the troublesome trek through the collection of tables and men sprawled about them. Upon drawing closer to the table centered near an open window in the far corner of the restaurant, Ichigo could see the other captains gathered around the low table. Kensei's stark gray hair and harsh eyes judged Ichigo as he drew close. Rose smiled in welcome, the flash of recognition in his eyes as the dim figure was illuminated by passing candles emitting heavy smoke. Love was settled beside Rose, a curious expression marking his face. Shinji quickly sprung to his feet, bouncing over to meet Ichigo halfway. He welcomed the younger Shinigami with a hug. Ichigo tensed and Shinji grasped the familiar Reisu washing over him and teasing his senses with loss and memory. Awkwardly returning the sudden interaction, Ichigo drew back, a warm smile on his lips. The man's lips curled up into a familiar Cheshire smirk as he drew Ichigo towards the table. "Rose, love, Kensei, I'm sure you met Ichigo before in a formal setting, but this is a bar, so there is no need for any affectations or manners of the sort. Got that, Ichi?" "Good, Ichigo. This is Rose, captain of the 3rd, Kensei captain of the 9th, and Love captain of the 7th. Fellow powerful captains, I introduce Ichigo Shiba, co-lieutenant of the 8th Division." Smirking proudly at his introduction, Shinji dragged Ichigo to an empty seat to the amused gaze of the other captains. Love shook his head in amusement at his friend's familiar antics, his large afro swaying faintly with the movement. Rose regarded the cup in front of him for a moment before keen eyes flashed to connect with Ichigo's caramel orbs, appearing appeased by what he found there. The blonde-haired man downed the liquid in the clay glass and said, "We've actually met before, Shinji, a few years ago, though it seems longer than that in the passing of time." Shinji arched an incredulous eyebrow, glancing between the two with a near suspicious curl to his eyes before he accepted his friend's words and turned pensive cocoa-colored eyes on Ichigo. Running his hand through orange strands, Ichigo sighed faintly, knowing that this night would be long already. His better judgment seemed to haphazardly throw caution to the wind on nights like this. "It's nice to be able to sit down with you all without the ever-watching gaze of the Suteiko." Ichigo's comment earned him a snort from Kensei, followed by an amused smile. Love nodded pleased and Rose curled his lips upwards. Ichigo hastily leaned out of the way as Shinji peered forward, arms ready to stretch out and flick Ichigo on the side of the head. The man muttered under his breath, "Damn snarky brat," in his eloquent speech. Laughter rippled around the table on soft eddies, and the tense atmosphere Ichigo's arrival had brought dissipated, leaving the warm aura of the bar in its place. A male waiter bustled over carrying a tray laden with empty glasses. He took stock of the members of the table before asking, "Can I get anyone anything else?" The waiter received negative replies, and Ichigo was inclined to join them, as he knew if he relented and ordered a drink he would be staying far longer than he planned to. Before the waiter could leave, Shinji spoke up and asked, "Ichigo, what about you? Ya just arrived, surely ya can stay long enough to enjoy a drink." Let it never be said that Shinji was not cunning or manipulative, as the man had that in spades. It was the reason Aizen and Shinji clashed, that and their ideals, or fashion sense, though that was debatable. Shaking his head in knowing amusement, Ichigo smiled apologetically at the waiter and asked, "May I please have whatever brew of tea available?" The man nodded, smiling in return before bustling off, picking up empty plates and glasses as he made his way to the kitchen, where a mess of steam and the sound of plates shuffling was centered. Returning his attention to the table, Ichigo was faced with Love's curious gaze. The man seemed to weigh his options before he spoke. "So Ichigo, there's many rumors floating about you? Care to confirm any?" Ichigo scoffed at the man's unsubtle prodding. Ichigo acknowledged that in truth there were many things he had hinted at or mistakenly revealed. Kukeiku had relayed some of the souls of Rungokai's words, and Ichigo was astounded by some of their thoughts. "I can confirm that I am not an angel in the Western sense, nor am I kami walking among men. Other than that, you may need to be a bit more specific, Love-san." Ichigo spoke easily in an assuring and teasing tone that didn't offend the large man. Love nodded amusement, crinkling his brow. Shinji scoffed regarding Ichigo in amusement. He mumbled under his breath, speaking of snarky lieutenants. Ichigo tilted his head, curious of the meaning of Shinji's words. He had an inkling that the man was speaking of Aizen, who was well known for his treatment of Shinji and how he managed to rile up the golden-haired Shinigami. Kensei smirked, looking at Ichigo in approval before he said, "We were actually just speaking of our lieutenants. In particular, Shinji was whining about his damn lieutenant and crazy third seat, as he so fondly calls them." Shinji muttered a chorus of "damn right" at Kensei's words, a small frown and troubled light entering his eyes. He turned to regard Ichigo. Before the man could ask whatever question plagued his mind, their waiter returned carrying a bottle of sake to refill the others' glasses in a pale grey mug with thin wisps of silver rising from it. The waiter set the glass down with a practiced ease, smiling kindly before he refilled their drinks and bustled off. "Yeah, no Aizen, right Ichi? I've seen the two of ya interact a few times, though I wouldn't say you're the best of friends. Kami knows that's impossible. Have you noticed anything different about him of late?" Shinji launched into his questioning as soon as the waiter had ambled off and the comfortable veil of secrecy and warmth had descended again. Ichigo was subtly surprised by Shinji's observation of his lieutenant, because as much as the man paraded around disdain of Aizen, he had to care if only a fraction to notice such differences. Thinking about the man and the many times they meet for brief periods so that Aizen could ask his question, Ichigo could not see so much of a difference. It was more seen in their more infrequent meetings under the eaves of the archives at high midnight or over a cup of tea for a philosophical discussion. "You're correct in that I'm familiar with Aizen. We occasionally meet up to discuss philosophy. Of late nothing too large seems amiss, though he does seem unfocused and his emotions slips past his mask with a frequent ease. Though what the cause is I couldn't say." Ichigo replied thoughtfully, though in truth an inkling of the cause rested in the back of his mind. Shinji regarded him warily for a moment before he came to an understanding, and the caution once prevalent in his eyes faded to a dim simmer. Looking Ichigo up and down, the man warned, "Just be careful, Ichi. Aizen isn't someone to mess with." Ichigo laughed at Shinji's warning, the sound bursting from his lips before he could stop the clear ringing sound. Controlling himself quickly, Ichigo let the laughter fade away to see both cautious and amused looks directed his way. Now Shinji, do stop harassing the young man. I'm sure Ichigo is capable of handling himself." Rose admonished in light tones, not putting Shinji in his place, merely making a casual remark. The blonde turned to regard the musician for a moment before his shoulders slumped in agreement. Kensei huffed and voiced his own discord. "At least you don't have to deal with Mashiro's kicks every morning. I swear the lime ball runs on sunlight alone." Kensei's gruff humor brought forth laughter, and Ichigo settled in his seat, the tense line of his shoulders fading as they relented to easy topics, mainly the happenings of Soul Society and the recent captain's meeting. "Ichigo, what is your opinion on the Suteiko's proposal to instate new laws within Soul Society?" Ichigo shook himself from ideal wanderings, acknowledging Rose's question with a smile. Ichigo smirked, deciding to set caution to the wind, and responded, "Well, I have to agree with many of them as I helped the Suteiko design them." Ichigo received blank looks at first before Shinji was spluttering and attempting to regain control of his calm and controlled mask that Hiyori had found a way of cracking to. A tea light sparked in coffee-colored eyes, and Shinji regarded Ichigo curiously, questioning the mystery that he posed, even as the other captains stared at Ichigo in continued surprise. Shinji coughed, taking a sip of sake before he posed his question. "Yeah, mean to say you helped the old man with laws such as the proposition of a militia in Rungokai?" Ichigo nodded, and the man smiled for a moment. Regarding Ichigo, he said, "Did anyone ever tell ya you're a bundle of mysteries?" Ichigo paused, thoughtful for a moment, gazing at the ceiling before he shook his head and replied, "Some things of the sort, but never a bundle of mysteries." Shinji's lips curled into a Cheshire smirk. He turned away from Ichigo, sharing a knowing look with the other occupants of the table as if appeasing some hidden agreement before he turned to face Ichigo and said, "I'm glad I had the foresight to call ya over." Ichigo scoffed but said nothing, and Love took it as a sign to continue their discussion. Ichigo interjected a few points as the discussion became heated, but otherwise was content to listen as the captains discussed days long past and the future of Soul Society. X. "Good evening, Ichigo." Aizen's deep tenor floated on the breeze towards Ichigo. The orangutan turned from the busy street vendor and crowded store windows to face Aizen. Smiling welcomingly, Ichigo stepped closer to the man and they walked in pace towards a more secluded area. "Good evening, Aizen. How does your research proceed?" Ichigo questioned, leaning against the roughly textured wall behind him. Aizen smirked, the light glinting off his glasses and catching the confidence in Coco orbs. The man paused for a moment, eyes glancing elsewhere in thought before he continued, research goes well. I've been studying external sources and the many texts the archives has to offer. But to more pressing matters. Were you born in Soul Society? Ichigo paused, looking into Aizen's eyes curious in the pale evening light of the stars. A smile of its own making slipped onto Ichigo's lips and he responded, I wasn't born in Soul Society nor this realm, but I am of Soul Society. Aizen frowned, obviously unexpecting the elusive answer Ichigo had given the lieutenant. The man continued to stare for a moment before with a promising smile he bade goodnight and swirled from the alleyway, ebony folds billowing ominously. Tilting his head in amusement, Ichigo watched the figure fade into the distance before he returned to the vendors. Ganju had given him a shopping list and Aizen be damned he would get the required ingredients. Skyscrapers rose towards the sky in sparse clusters, folds of emerald peeking from within their cracked shells. The sky was somber and overcast, rain falling in endless waves to collect below. Ichigo, sprawled on one of the many buildings, heaved a restless sigh. His heart was heavy in his chest, gluing him to the cool metal below. Rain beat against his face in a dull thrum, resounding in his mind and lulling him into a false calm. White filled Ichigo's vision, accompanied by golden eyes in a sea of ebony. Shiro pouted eyes mocking as he extended a hand and said, "What's got ya so blue, kingy?" Ichigo shrugged as much as one could while lying on the ground and reached up to take the proffered hand. Familiar strength pulled him up till Ichigo was facing Shiro, mirror images against a tempestuous background. Rolling his shoulders, Ichigo's gaze searched the vast skyscraper they perched on. In the distance a shadowy figure of cloaked ebony stood, green peaked up beside Zanjitsu and curled around his spirit's feet. Padding over to the chocolate-haired incarnation of a younger Bak, Ichigo called out over his shoulder, "I'm restless. Though for what reason I cannot say, the future weighs heavily on my shoulders." Zanjitsu looked up from where his gaze had been drawn to the curling buds. He studied Ichigo, taking in his wielder's appearance with soft, compassionate eyes hidden behind the yellow visors he always wore. Crouching, Ichigo studied the encroaching plant seeding its roots in the side of the building, burrowing through soil of thick steel. Its leaves were a rich ebony with amber threads tracing its skeleton. Shiro approached slowly, instincts ingrained in the fiber of his being leading him to prowl as the prey stalks the hunter. "Ichigo, why are you uncertain?" Zanjitsu's deep baritone rustled along Ichigo's ears, calming frayed nerves and clearing his thoughts of the hazy doubt that plagued them. Pushing himself up from the crouch, Ichigo felt strong arms snake around his waist to pull Ichigo into Shiro's chest. The hollow purred for a moment before falling silent, awaiting Ichigo's answer. In the little mobility Shiro provided him, Ichigo ran a hand through his hair, accumulating his thoughts. He replied, "All that has happened and will happen. The few experiments that we've seen conducted by Aizen were some of his first. This means the man has only started to dawdle in hollowification. Then what of the experiments recorded in the archives? They weren't performed by Aizen, rather from what I gather he was inspired by such, and having witnessed one himself not long ago, though he could not identify who, he became interested. Who conducted these experiments? The more I decode of the ancient tome, the more I wonder what my mind is seeing and if it is at all possible for there to be another. He's planning it. The hollowification, the wizard, and I know it must happen. It's one thing that I cannot save them from, for if we do not let it happen, what weapon do we possess against the Quincy? Even so, I will not allow them to be banished. Soul Society will accept them. But will they ever accept me for what I am? I'm so far from Shinigami or anything normal. How do I even convince the Suteiko to accept them? For if I fail in that, then Aizen will lose hope and see that Soul Society can't change. I've proven to him that he isn't alone. My power is proof, and the combined intellect of Kisuke and I should be enough. But if he goes through with this, and he will, then what will he see? Acceptance? Does that mean that they will accept me? For the only way to convince the Suteiko would be to show him. But how much? Will Aizen feel guilt now that his emotions run rampant inside him? I don't want to see hate on their faces, betrayal in their eyes. I've experienced that once already. They'll believe any lie, but when it comes to truth and change, they are as stubborn as the planets in their rotation. Zanjitsu, how do I know this will succeed? If it all falls to ruin, I may lose them all. Letting his fears and worries be said aloud, Ichigo fell back into Shiro's arms, boneless and tired in a way few could contemplate. He felt drained, having spoken the words he feared aloud. Zanjitsu regarded Ichigo warmly, and Shiro's arms tightened around his torso, providing silent support. His spirit's Reisu flowed over him, assuring him and comforting him even as Zanjitsu spoke, "Ichigo, trust in yourself and family. Byakuya and Kai and those who have supported you and glimpsed the most of your soul will not leave you till they know the truth, and even then, they would stand by you. The Vizard will come to be and you will show them what it truly means to have a part of your soul hollowified. Aizen and Kisuk will see far more than they can understand at this moment, and from that Aizen will seek the truth with conviction of your words and your soul. The man is already changed, you only need guide him. The Suteiko will not throw aside your words so easily, he will seek proof, and to give him that is a small matter. Stand resolute, Ichigo, you can do this if only you strive forward. Letting yourself wallow in doubt and hesitation will burden your soul all the more. All things will reveal themselves in time, you need only be ready to face it as you have faced everything before you. Zanjitsu's warm hand rested against Ichigo's cheek, piercing blue eyes staring into his own from behind yellow shades, conveying his words even as Reisu rose around the three figures so uniquely intertwined their bond would not be found among any else. Ichigo nodded, eyes full of heavy fire lightning till they swirled with Reisu, the three's Reisu curling and writhing around them as Ichigo nodded his determination and acceptance. Zanjitsu drew back after a few minutes, a proud smile lingering on his face as heavy laden clouds dispersed to let thin rays of light dance brilliantly across metal. Shiro smirked, pulling the two away from Zanjitsu. He pushed his wielder a few feet apart and drew the matching katana at his side. What do ya say to a spar, Kingy? Have to stay in shape somehow. Shiro cackled, bloodlust eager on his pale face. Ichigo smirked in return, rolling his shoulders even as he complained, we dueled 2 nights ago. Shiro nodded, paused, pretending to think on the matter before he shook his head and replied, true, Kingy, but that was only blade work. Ya gotta exercise ya Bankai and Shikai, else ya get lazy in handling us. Ichigo laughed, the tension and strain plaguing him before faded. He flicked his katana in front of him, summoning his large reserves of Reisu. He channeled it into the blade, dyeing it a deep ebony. He called out, tear the skies asunder, Zanjitsu. Reisu swirled around Ichigo and he basked in the feeling of his powers, free and uncontained in his inner world where they could run rampant. In his hands the familiar weight of his dual blades was comforting, and he easily swung the smaller blade to the side, sending a wave of Reisu careening into the distance. Within seconds Shiro was in front of him, blades clashing against the ones held in his hand with the jarring sound of metal against metal. Excitement pulsed in Ichigo's veins. He missed the challenge of a fight, feeling the exhilaration of meeting an opponent equally matched or of higher power sent his blood boiling. Bouncing back, he swung the longer blade, calling out, get Chuga Tensho, and watched as the arc of ebony and midnight blue Reisu raced towards Shiro. The hollow raised his blades pale ivory and intersected them in a cross shape where the attack was repelled and absorbed into the blades. Giving the hollow no time to recover, Ichigo charged forward, their blades a heavy clash ringing throughout the silence of his inner world. Back and forth the mirror images fought, neither gaining ground nor giving to the other. Ichigo felt all ache and the tiredness that plagued his body evaporate, leaving him feeling rejuvenated. Bringing the twin blades of Zanjitsu in front of his chest, Ichigo struck the smaller blade through the opening of the longer one. Channeling his Reisu into the blades, Ichigo smirked and let go the silent whisper of Bankai, unheard in the roar of Reisu. X. Anohana, if you were forced to participate in war from a young age, found the need to go to unstoppable lengths to defeat an enemy, what would you do once it was over? Anohana glanced to the side where Ichigo was sprawled across a tatami at the top of his yukata, undone and resting in folds by his waist. Orange hair caught the light from shuttered windows and sparked like fire within a hearth. Anohana was surprised Ichigo had spoken first between the two. Ichigo, after what was obliviously much debate, had taken her offer to talk to her even if it was accompanied by the guise of a checkup. He had paced outside the fourth errant Reisu, tense like a coiled spring, and Anohana had let out a small breathless laugh at the anticipation and nervousness that plagued the young Shinigami before sweeping out of the fourth to confront the orangutan and drag him to her office. Focusing her attention on the teapot in her hands, Retsu let the soft hum of Reisu infused with the healing benefits of Kido flow from her hands into the ceramic, heating the water inside. Thinking over Ichigo's question as the tea steeped, Anohana paced to the low-set oak table and placed the teapot onto the table with a gentle flourish. Looking up from where she had settled into place opposite Ichigo, her eyes traced the patchwork of scars running across Ichigo's body. The mere image of them sent spirals of protection and righteous fury at whoever had caused wounds curling through her system, calming rage unfamiliar to her in its time long past. Retsu spoke, that depends, Ichigo, on what matter of war one fought in. To fight in a rebellion where one darts in and out from hidden covers and works in the shadows is vastly different from a war on open plains with two clear opposing forces. The orangutan bowed his head in thought, a calloused hand reaching up to run through long strands. A familiar habit of Ichigo's. Anohana had noted one he often performed when his mind was occupied. Lifting the teapot in sure and steady hands, Retsu tipped the heavy clay, letting the liquid stain a deep amber trickle from the sprout like the roaring plains of a waterfall. Ichigo muttered a thanks. Straightening fractionally in his seat, he reached forward and grasped the clay mug. Shielding it in his hands, he brought it to his lips and took a slow sip of the near-scorching liquid. Placing the ceramic onto the table, Ichigo let out a content sigh. Tense shoulders settling faintly, he looked up, warm caramel eyes connecting with her own, calm as the tempestuous sea silver orbs. He said, I fought in 2 wars, Anohana Teiko. What does that make me, a broken soul? Ichigo's voice became bitter and he looked away, hiding vicious pain deep-seated in his heart. No anger or accusations did he direct her way. His question was that of one who already knew the answer and was making a point. Retsu felt the breath catch in her lungs at such emotion and the truth Ichigo had revealed. The man held secrets wrapped in the very fiber his being. Rarely did he answer, and often were they half-truths or vague. This was one of the first pieces of evidence that she could clearly identify, and the information only burned her heart as she gazed upon his wounds in a new light. Surely those wars could not have been long ago? You are far too young. You must have been a teenager when you participated. Ichigo, did you die in those wars you spoke of? Laughter followed her words, not humors in nature, rather jaded and sardonic. He found her words amusing in a sense that Retsu doubted she would ever understand. Calming himself, Anohana caught a glimpse of chocolate eyes soaked in pain and felt her heart stutter in her chest. Ichigo's Reisu curled protectively around himself, soothing away the frayed edges of his mask. He took a sip of tea, taking the moment to fortify his strength. I lived through those wars. Was captured, tortured, beaten, and wounded. These scars are a testament to how I lived in all my memories. Maybe I died somewhere along the way, but I lived till the end, where my comrades had fallen around me, nameless graves and ashes on the wind. Anohana, with hands clenched around the porcelain in her hand and a part of her mind disconnected from the situation, wondered if it was going to snap under the pressure she was exerting. Torture, the word rang in her mind, devastating her thoughts and drawing her eyes to Ichigo's torso once more. Ichigo stood up, his legs carrying him as he began to pace, running a hand through flaming locks in exasperation. Taking in calming breaths, Anohana placed her mug down with none of the gentleness common in her actions and asked, have you spoken to anyone? Ichigo's Reisu pulsed and the young man turned to face her for a moment before he settled boneless in the pillows sprawled across the floor. Shaking his head, amber eyes became unfocused and he replied, I've spoken to my Zanpakuto. How can you not? They're part of your soul. But otherwise, when does one find time in war? And in these times of peace few understand nor could handle my words. You've seen the beginning of Soul Society, and fought in the blood war. Perhaps you understand better than I. Anohana sat back, stunned in a way she hadn't been for a long time. This enigma who hid behind endless folds of secrecy was suffering, a soul fractured and yet not broken, not close to it. He had pulled himself together for so long. The desolation in his eyes was only evidence of time past where no hope had existed. Only now had the healing of wounds scabbed but not healed begun. With family and friends, slowly was Ichigo retreating from the darkness. He was wise in a way that one didn't see with age. Perhaps, Anohana thought to herself, it was a forced maturity and experience, or rather an accumulation of all that had happened. Questions and sorrow flowed through Retsu's mind. She wondered how this lone Shinigami could know of the blood war, where once white paved sheets had glimmered with a layer of blood that had rained near constantly. She then questioned why he was trusting her with this information so precious and dangerous. For if one could see the soul hidden underneath, Anohana was certain they wouldn't understand. Why tell me this and not the Suteiko? She questioned, her mind dawning fondly on Yamamoto. The old man was cunning and often played with lives of the Shinigami as if the world was one great chessboard. But he cared for those taken under his wings, and Anohana had seen their chess matches in passing. The old man looked on Ichigo with fondness born of unique understanding and care for the individual before him. Rolling his shoulders in a vague shrug, Ichigo looked up hastily, seeing the fierce echo of emotions welling up in Anohana's eyes, and said, the time for that is drawing near. Everything is reaching its climax, and the final outcome is what depicts my future. I find myself lost now and then, doubts plague my every step and I falter for a breath. And then I'm reminded of myself and my blade, for if I hesitate then I will perish under the undulating sands of time. Anohana Teiko, I come to you as your opinion is unbiased by what you know of me, your heart sways with the guidance of a doctor, a healer. Therefore, you've already seen what few have yet to grasp. Please Taiko, I'm healing. I know it's a slow process and I'm sure I'll never be whole again. But I'm clinging to hope like the candle flame on a cold winter's night. Determination blazed in Ichigo's eyes like the fires that sprung to life when Ryujinjaka is released. Anohana understood now far more why this Shinigami was so powerful. It was not in his power or his blade, it lay in his heart and the power of his will. Uncertain on how to proceed from such a fierce declaration, Retsu gingerly took a sip of the now lukewarm tea. Stillness hung in the air and one could hear a pin drop. Ichigo, you never answered my question from that day in the fourth. What do you plan to do afterwards? Ichigo slumped, though a peaceful smile was now lazily resting on his face. Leaning back, the orangutan caressed the pommel of his Zanpakuto in thought. Tilting his head back to face the wooden ceiling above, he said, Live. Live well, age well, and see each dawn with a smile. Anohana smiled, the movement unsuspected as it slipped onto her lips. Ichigo looked at peace with the light of the sun casting his hair aflame and illuminating his face in warm tones, caressing the light in soulful eyes. Thank you, Anohana Taiko. Retsu looked up at Ichigo's words of thanks and accepted them with a nod, noting the tension that had riled Ichigo's shoulders since he entered her office had left. The young man looked comfortable, as if in revealing such things he had bared his soul to her, afraid of rejection, and she in accepting him had gained his trust. Quiet settled around them as they finished their tea, no words leaving their lips. X. Chapter 17, Sayamaki. X. The air was cool with a crispness that left Ichigo burning inside, pacing outside the Suteiko's office where he knew the old man still slaved over paperwork. Ichigo bit his lip, trying to muster the courage to lift his hand and knock on the great wooden doors carved elegantly. The first was near empty in the quiet of night, a select few dwelling in hidden alcoves. Rolling his shoulders, Ichigo took a deep breath. Slowly wasting every precious second, Ichigo placed his curled fist against the door and knocked. The sound echoed in the vast and quiet halls of the first. Silence held, and Ichigo glanced apprehensively at the door, impatience and dread warring in his stomach. The doors gave a great heave before they slowly began to glide open. The Suteiko's Reisu curled around their frame. Taking a deep breath, the encouraging whisper of Zanjutsu in his mind, Ichigo walked forward, steps silent upon wooden floors, accompanied by the faint swish of fabric. Yamamoto was hunched over his desk, candles flickering unendingly in clusters sparsely spattered around the room. Paperwork seemed to encroach on him from all sides, the stacks tilting and wobbling precariously. The old man looked up from his desk, caterpillar-like eyebrows raised in surprise. In a detached manner, Ichigo remarked that he was likely coiling his Reisu too tightly around himself if the Suteiko could not sense him. Ichigo, welcome. What can I help you with? Ichigo sighed at his seemingly innocent question and walked forward till he was standing in front of the desk. Wringing his hands in front of him, Ichigo pivoted slightly to look out the large windows that hovered on one side of the room. Yamamoto frowned at Ichigo's silence but didn't push for the younger Shinigami to speak. He had lived for years beyond measure. A few moments of silence were nothing to him. Ichigo stared for a few more minutes before he began pacing slightly, glancing every few seconds at the Suteiko. Yamamoto sighed and in his voice deep with age said, You are anxious tonight? What troubles you? Come sit, I will make some tea, though it is nothing to Kojiro's. The old man pushed himself up from the desk with a huff and hobbled off, the tapping of his cane echoing his movements as he moved to one of the corners of the room where water resided in a bowl and was placed beside a copper teapot in a selection of teas. Ichigo fell boneless into the chairs placed in front of Yamamoto's desk, his gaze returned pensive to the indigo sky. The moon hung in the sky, pale and full, a circle of glowing light like a halo. The Suteiko bustled back with the teapot in hand, the metal singing beneath his skin as Reisu, the color of burning embers, glowed within his skin and transferred to the teapot. When a thin wisp of steam curled from the spout, the Suteiko set the large object on his desk and pulled out a small packet of herbs. The calming scent of lavender and chamomile floated around the room, swirling upon heavy smoke from tall tallow candles. The herbs were dumped into the steaming water and the Suteiko settled into his seat, gaze expectant but patient. You are correct, I am troubled. The future weighs heavily on me this night and on my decisions, all the more so. The Suteiko remained silent as Ichigo spoke, regarding him keenly with coffee-colored eyes rarely revealed. Ichigo ran a hand through his hair, agitated and uncertain. He looked past the man old beyond count and let his eyes trace the wood paneling beyond him. Yamamoto poured the tea with practiced ease, the hot liquid dyed a deep amber. Ichigo took the proffered cup and cradled it close to his chest, letting the warmth seep into his soul. I'm from the future. The man stared at Ichigo, eyebrows rising and cocoa orbs revealing themselves. The man paused before he took a slow sip of tea and nodded. Silence reigned and Ichigo let Yamamoto ponder Ichigo's sudden revelation. Taking a sip of the scorching tea, Ichigo felt some of his nerves settle while the rest flew like a collection of butterflies in his stomach. Finally, the old man looked up, eyes locking with Ichigo's own. He asked, "Why are you telling me this now?" Ichigo stood up hastily, turning from the old man. He ran his hands through his hair in exasperation and paced towards the window. Looking out upon the alabaster buildings and terracotta roofs stretching as far as the eyes could see. Frowning, Ichigo pushed down the bubbling fears of rejection and betrayal, the lingering sense of doubt, and said, "Some time from now in the near future a select group of captains and lieutenants are going to encounter a mission they will not return the same from. Do you recall our talk of hollows not many days ago? We spoke of the balance of life. For there to be a balance there must be Shinigami and hollow. The reason for the genocide of the Quincy lies in their ability to disturb that balance. You know he's still alive. Gathering power, plotting from the shadows and amassing a force to destroy Soul Society, but he is still weak and that time is far off. Now something will arise and your choice, Soul Society's choice, will aid us or leave us in the dust." The Suteiko frowned, brows furrowing as he considered the pale specter illuminated by moonlight. Ichigo was clearly distraught, a mess of tangled emotions that Yamamoto had never seen in the young man. His thoughts drew to the boy's revelation and he thought on the matter of it and the information given to him. Did he trust Ichigo? The young man had proven wise beyond his years, with a weary soul hidden behind deep eyes that drew you in. Ichigo was quick and witty, easy to smile in a friend's presence but cold and uncaring in others. The man was strong. Yamamoto had seen it all those years ago, when he fought the member of his squad, all quiet grace and strong lethality hidden behind tough sinew. It was still apparent today in the katana at his waist or the reisu curling around him. What do you mean? You're being elusive and riddlesome as always. Ichigo snorted, amused before growing somber once more. He turned quickly to regard the Suteiko, assessing what lay in his eyes before he whipped around and paced in front of the window for a few steps. The young man took a few deep breaths before slowly he walked towards Yamamoto. Once in front of the man who had become a mentor to him in their many meetings over tea, Ichigo looked into his eyes and began. I was 18 the first time I interacted with a Shinigami. I was powerful as a human with too much reisu and no knowledge of the way it leaked around me. It attracted a hollow to our house and the Shinigami tried to save us but was injured. To defeat the hollow, I stabbed their Zanpakuto into the very center of my being and took on some of their powers. Then Soul Society found out and they were taken back to be executed. I couldn't stand for it, so I, among friends who had developed their own powers, invaded Soul Society to save them. That was the beginning of it all. We fought against captains and lieutenants trying to race against time before their very soul was destroyed by the Sokyoku. I was forced to gain my Bankai within 3 days. We succeeded in rescuing her only for the true villains to reveal themselves, powerful, and among captain level they took a weapon of mass power and fled to Hueco Mundo. There the Espada were created or formed hollows who had taken on human-like appearance and could seal their power within a katana. Thus, the first war began. The Winter War it was called, though for such reasons is debatable. Hollows fighting Shinigami on a massive scale as we sought to keep the powerful artifact from the hands of a madman, a megalomaniac who had lost all intelligence and had become corrupted with power. The war lasted 3 years, bloody and long. The human world soon became temporarily sealed off. That madman performed an experiment long in the past before I was born. He hollow-fied Shinigami of high rank, corrupting, one might say, part of their souls. They were banned, along with a genius who took the blame, to the human world where they grew bitter with Soul Society, yet their hatred for him was stronger. They fought with us and were invaluable as their power from such transformation increased tenfold. To defeat the madman when no one else could, I embraced a technique that would grant me power to defeat them, but at the cost of my powers. I stopped what he had become long enough for Aikido to wrap around him and seal his powers. For a year, I lived in a so-called peace with half of my soul missing as the world turned on without me. In time, I found a way to gain my powers back, though it was false, and it was after the ordeal that they were reignited within my soul. Time after that dragged on too fast and another battle began, a war that had lasted over 1,000 years and would last 10 more long years. In this war the Hollows, and the Quincy so desperately purified, fought as mindless beasts tearing at either side. But the holified Shinigami were of great assets against the Quincy, their Reisu tainted against the purity of that bloodline. The war that ripped everything I knew away from me. I was the last survivor, the only one alive. I went back, how is a mystery I've been trying to solve. I found myself surrounded by familiar faces that didn't know me, their deaths were flashing in my mind and I could only smile because they wouldn't understand, I couldn't tell them if I wanted to. And now I've told you. Ichigo bowed his head after finishing his story, eyes not daring to peek up and see the expression on the Suteiko's face, fearing disbelief, rage, anger, betrayal or any number of things he had faced before. Curling hands into balled fists at his sides, Ichigo listened to the soft murmur of Zanjutsu in the back of his mind. The Suteiko sat there silent and more shocked than he felt he had ever been in his life before. This man in front of him was impossible, his mind whispered, even his instincts and his Zanpakuto whispered that his words were the truth if somewhat excluding details and names. His mind, a cavern of memories stored layer upon layer, tried to comprehend the being in front of him. So much made sense now. His remarkable power and bond with his Zanpakuto spirits. The wisdom and knowledge he always seemed to possess, a certain foresight. And the age of his eyes unreflecting that of his body. Yamamoto had known the eyes of many soldiers but none so like Ichigo's. With such power the young man would have been put on the battlefield leading the charge far too many times, and to have to handle the so-called megalomaniac by himself. Studying the man in front of him, Yamamoto could see tense shoulders and a head bowed, whether in fear of his reaction or the weight of the truth the head captain could not discern. Ichigo slowly looked up to meet the Suteiko's eyes of smoldering coals, warm and welcoming, accepting the wayward soul for all that he had revealed and was. Ichigo smiled. The Suteiko felt surprise curl inside him at the smile, far different from the everyday one seen on his face. This was raw and open in a happiness Ichigo rarely displayed. Standing up, the Suteiko left their cups of tea unattended. By now they were cool to the touch. Nodding to the lieutenant to follow him, Ichigo responded in kind and followed the Suteiko across Soul Society. Great gales of wind blew across Sokioku Hill in the dead of night, picking up tumbles of dust to swirl around their feet. The whole of Soul Society lay before them and around them, an awe-inspiring sight that left emotions welling inside his chest. The Sokioku rested behind them, ominous in the night, a still figure of the past, and Ichigo a figure lost in time, orange hair glinting under the moon's pale beams. I remember this view well. Ichigo's voice was soft, a quiet whisper upon the breeze, and Yamamoto turned to regard the youth, taking in eyes hazed with memory and fondness before turning to face the sprawling vista once more. These holified Shinigami, they are the incident you speak of. Ichigo nodded, appeasing Yamamoto's curiosity. The old man continued, how do I know they will be able to control themselves, be able to function in Soul Society? You said they had years in the human world to master such power. Ichigo turned with a smirk on his face, eyes bright and glowing under the moon. He pulled a hand over his face in one smooth motion, Reisu of deep ebony cloaking his hands. Yamamoto's hand instinctively went to the pommel of his cane, ready to draw the blade before his mind caught up to him and he forced himself to relax. Ichigo was looking at him from under a mask of bone. Sharp lines of crimson traced the mask, and from underneath 2 golden orbs in a sea of black peered out at him. Give them a month with me and I can teach them. I know a few scientists who would be eager to help. The way they found to control their inner hollows was incorrect and therefore took longer. Given time and training they will be able to control it with ease. The first month would simply be an introduction and way to ease them into this new change. Ichigo's voice took on a dual tone, as if 2 beings were speaking as one. With a swift jerk of his hand the mask was resting his palm. Golden eyes still remained surrounded by ebony sclera, and he watched in disinterest as the bone mask broke into pieces, drifting away on the high winds, wiping the folds of their shiakshos about. Yamamoto turned and regarded the Shinigami, staring into eyes fading from gold to warm chocolate. His eyes were honest and open, ready to accept whatever verdict with a jadedness few would see. Yamamoto sighed, muttering about his age. For a moment he turned a pensive gaze on all of Soul Society and said, I trust you in this and will support you when the time comes. Ichigo smiled once more, that smile that warmed Yamamoto's heart and made him want to protect the young man just to see that smile once more. Turning to gaze at Soul Society he said, if you ever need an old man to talk to, my doors are open. Ichigo took a small step closer, his Reisu curled about his figure like a cloak. He said, thank you. I won't fail. Yamamoto had no doubt of the Orangette's conviction or words. Power dwelled within him, the power to change Soul Society for the better and the will to protect those he loved. Yamamoto could easily respect that which he saw in the young man, similar to days of his own youth. Byakuya paced impatiently, standing in front of the worn path familiar to mind and memory. Glancing up, his gaze roved over the collection of sentinels rising around him, ancient and strong in their silence. Letting out a small sigh of amusement, Byakuya stopped the irrelevant movements to the pleasure of Senbonzakura, who was nagging him for the agitated movements. The young lieutenant wondered where his friend was. It was unlike Ichigo to be late, even more so when the Oranget had arranged the meeting. Byakuya thought fondly of the time a few days past where Ichigo had appeared in the doorway of the office Byakuya worked in alongside his grandfather. Leaning casually against the frame, a lazy smile had curled on Ichigo's carved features. Underneath the front of relaxed amusement, Byakuya could see the tense lines to his friend's shoulders, and the deep purple under his eyes seemed more pronounced. Ichigo had spoken swiftly, and though appearing calm, Byakuya could see anxiety in amber orbs, an emotion Ichigo rarely sported. Even now his fingers drummed against Senbonzakura's hilt, concern weighing heavily on his heart. His friend was troubled, and Byakuya knew nothing of his friend's sorrow. Faint rustling from the trees snapped Byakuya's attention from concern and brought his senses to high alert. His fist curled at his side, unconsciously resting near Senbonzakura's hilt. As the rasu of the being hidden behind dark alcoves of the path became apparent, Byakuya let out a sigh, tense shoulders settling as a head of orange revealed itself. Ichigo stalked from the tree's long orange tresses, swaying slightly with the movement. The ebony folds of his shiakusho flowed around his lithe form. A genuine smile appeared on Ichigo's face, and fondness shone in his eyes. Byakuya grinned in kind. Walking forward to meet his friend, he clasped an arm around Ichigo's form, frowning briefly when the young man flinched at the touch before he pulled Ichigo closer against his chest. Trying to convey his support for his friend in the embrace, Byakuya felt Ichigo settle in his arms, slowly rising to mirror his own movements. They clasped around his chest. Pulling back, Byakuya looked Ichigo up and down in closer vicinity, taking in his friend's appearance with a critical eye. Ichigo seemed weary but relieved, in a way opposite to the state Byakuya had last seen the orange-haired Shinigami. His eyes seemed bright in an emotion Byakuya likened to joy or relief. It was strange to see Ichigo so carefree, but it also lightened the unknown weight that always settled on Byakuya's heart when he saw his friend in such a state. Ever since they had graduated the academy, the pressure burdening Ichigo's shoulders had increased. Byakuya feared the weight would crush his friend, and yet Ichigo remained impossibly strong and determined. "Well met, Ichigo, it has been far too long." Byakuya greeted, his voice disrupting the blanketed silence of the forest. Ichigo inclined his head, eyes casting about the place, checking for invisible enemies, or so Byakuya assumed. Ichigo returned caramel eyes to catch Byakuya's own. He responded, "Hello Byakuya. Shall we walk?" His name was said with fondness, a peculiar light shining in Ichigo's eyes before reluctantly he continued and asked his question. Weight seemed to descend upon Ichigo's shoulders at his own question, as if he dreaded what their walk among one of the many paths lost in the deep forests of Rungokai would bring. Byakuya nodded, gazing speculatively at his friend, asking a silent question that Ichigo denied responding. Together they began walking along the path, carved more so by animals rather than the occasional human. It was overgrown with puffs of grass rising up to ensnare their ankles and stray weeds gathered in small clusters. Relaxed stillness hung about them as they walked, comfortable and calm in the other's presence. No words were needed. Byakuya basked in the presence of his friend, head tilting back to gaze at a sky of rich blue. On the horizon clouds were collecting, ripe and swollen. They promised fearful rain later. For now, they lazed laxly, ominous but not threatening. The forest rising on all sides was like a curtain blocking out the outside world. With Ichigo beside him, Byakuya felt as if they had left Soul Society far behind and entered another realm. "Byakuya!" Ichigo started, disrupting the silence before he fell quiet, doubt plaguing his tone and choking his voice. Turning to face his friend in concern, Byakuya noted a paleness to Ichigo's face. His head was turned rebelliously to glance at the trees, but Byakuya could see the doubt in his chocolate orbs. Waiting patiently, the two stopped in their movement, the stillness of the land around them hanging off their shoulders like a suffocating cloak. Giving Ichigo his silence, Byakuya was rewarded a few moments later when Ichigo took in a deep stuttering breath, his gaze furtively glancing to Byakuya, assessing the ebony-haired Shinigami. He spoke, "Change is coming to Soul Society. I am going to play a part in this change." Byakuya was relieved that the young man was not delivering devastating news of some imminent demise, and yet his heart faltered in his chest at Ichigo's tone. Hesitant and fearful it seemed to echo in his mind, rebounding constantly and ensnaring his thoughts in desperate claws of protectiveness and fear. Taking a deep breath, Byakuya's hand steeled to rest against his sheathed blade, seeking the comfort of his Zanpakuto in the chill that rattled his soul. Byakuya accepted Ichigo's words, not questioning why his friend was speaking of this to him. He had the vague notion that Kyan and himself were the two souls who knew Ichigo the most. Some others may have known his turbulent past, or glimpsed the fiery inferno that raged inside his soul. But none knew who Ichigo was and how he functioned between the mask he presented and the front he cowered behind in company of family. Ichigo glanced at Byakuya, studying the open acceptance in silver eyes before, with a heavy sigh betraying the calm tilt of his head, he continued, "You may hear things, see things, and I won't be there to tell you why or how. I can't leave you in darkness, not when I've been in the shadows far too many times." Ichigo's next words sent Byakuya's heart racing, his mind grinding to a stop and descending into a hazy mist of panic when Ichigo mentioned his absence and the trouble to come. Of his own accord, he turned to face the orang at his plaintive worry and concern apparent on his features. Ichigo stepped back, eyes wide and the vast display of emotions sprawling across Byakuya's features. He stared guilty for a moment, then said, "I can't tell you everything, not yet. You remember my promise to you? Made summers long past? I will tell you, but for now I can only give you partial truths. Forgive me, my friend." Byakuya cursed his inability to speak as his soul shivered in remembrance of the cool fire that had scorched Ichigo's eyes. That expression was fixed in his mind, the memory never far from hand when thoughts of Ichigo's secrets troubled his head and weighed his heart. Mounting the courage to speak, Byakuya regarded Ichigo and looked into eyes full of deep wisdom and age and whispered, "Ichigo, my friend, I understand and remember that day well. Tell me what you can and settle my heart as it beats like the rapid drums of war in my chest." Ichigo's lips curled up in a faint impression of a smile at the dry humor in Byakuya's words, the teasing tones chasing away darkness that clung to Ichigo's eyes, heavy and shrouded. Shaking his head, the movement sending a cascade of orange locks to hang in front of Ichigo's eyes, shading their light from view. The man took in a breath before he strode away from Byakuya, pacing the narrow path in a dizzying motion. His reisu curled about his form, nearly visible in filtered sunlight. It whispered assurances in Ichigo's ears, and Byakuya could see his friend relax slightly even as he frowned in thought, brow furrowed. "What I'm about to tell you is sensitive information, and what I show you even more so." Byakuya nodded, determination filling his eyes. Ichigo stopped pacing, facing Byakuya. He stepped forward, bringing the two closer. The orange-haired man stared into his eyes impassively for what felt like a millennium of time. He felt as if his soul was pinned to that moment in time and only Ichigo could release him. The spell was broken as Ichigo raised a hand to run through his hair hastily, a scowl familiar flitting on his face for a brief moment. "There is going to be a mission soon. Lieutenants and captains will be sent to investigate. They will come back changed, far different and more powerful. And I will make sure that Soul Society accepts them, even if it means drastic measures. When they are accepted, I will have to help them. And it has to be me, because..." Byakuya tried to wrap his mind around the tangle of words and the burning fire of Ichigo's words. When Ichigo let his sentence die, he hesitantly raised his hand to drag it slowly and tentatively down his face, ebony reisu unique to Ichigo curling and pulsing in his hands. A bone-white mask was revealed, akin to the ones the hollows sported, but far more elegant in the curves of crimson that traced the mask. From within the holes where the eyes rested, two glowing orbs of gold in a sea of black met his own. Inherently primal, yet also Ichigo's eyes, a vast range of emotions and warmth only his eyes held. Instinctively his hand lurched to Senbonzakura's blade, his fist curling around the pommel. He took a deep breath, beating down ingrained instincts to kill the pale creatures on sight. Attempting to look beyond the mask, Byakuya was met with Ichigo's humanity, fear and hope waging war in his soul. Tensely Byakuya released his hand from the blade, eyes flickering up, acceptance radiating in silver orbs. Ichigo continued, "Only I can help them. What you see is close to whatever you have likely thought of, in that inherently this mask is of hollow make. Yet it is of my own power, my own soul. I cannot explain it now, but if you push, ask me, I will speak. For how can I deny you this truth so harshly when you have already accepted me?" Ichigo's voice held a dual-tone quality, as if two were speaking through one channel. Byakuya processed Ichigo's offer. The mask disappeared as he finished his question, leaving familiar features and eyes open and sparkling as he spoke of acceptance. It was here Byakuya could see the reason for Ichigo's pensiveness and anxiety. The man feared nothing, or at least that was the unwavering front he presented. Byakuya knew the truth. Ichigo feared the loss of his family and friends. He feared finding their corpses, knowing he was powerless to save them. Now Byakuya could see that Ichigo also feared betrayal or rejection, whichever was more prominent. The man strong as the highest fortified walls was scared of seeing bitter hate and disgust in his friend's eyes. The terror that imposed in him was obvious now, and Byakuya felt his heart shudder for Ichigo to feel such fear so deeply. He had to have experienced it once before. I will not push you, Ichigo, for an answer. Know this, I am beside you always. Whatever truth you reveal could not persuade me from my path nor deter me from the love I feel for you. Ichigo turned wide eyes of surprise towards Byakuya and disbelief, his mouth flicking open for a moment before snapping shut. He stared at Byakuya before sweeping forward to enfold his friend in a grasp of iron steel. Byakuya let out a tiny sound of surprise before he reached up, pulling the two closer together. He rested his head against Ichigo, staring into deep chocolate orbs, conveying the honesty of his words. Byakuya, fate's fool I may be, but she was kind in allowing me to meet you. Eyes widening at the playful yet sentimental words, Byakuya pulled back to see a lopsided smile curling Ichigo's lips. It was faint and warm and sent Byakuya's heart racing in his chest even as a smile slipped across his own lips. Breaking apart, the two Shinigami looked up as thick drops of rain began a slow descent towards green encroached ground. The storm clouds, so seemingly far away, were now above them, pregnant with the weight of the water they bore. They looked ready to downpour on the two unsuspecting Shinigami any second. Trading an amused glance with Ichigo, the two began a mad race towards Rungokai, where they could hole up in one of the many restaurants to a warm cup of tea. They were unfortunate, and before they reached covered shelter the rain began in earnest. Great peals of thunder rang above their heads and lightning splayed across the clouds alight. It pounded all around them, drowning out all sound till all one could hear was the monotonous pitter-patter of rain and the rush of their own blood. Ichigo turned to Byakuya, a bright smirk on his face. He reached behind him and grasped Byakuya's wrist in his calloused hands. Before Byakuya could protest the inevitable, they were gone, the forest a mere haze in his mind's eye. The village they arrived to was small, with a dilapidated feeling of uncare. Ichigo charged forward, unaware of the state of the small town where foreign glares chased their figures. The tallest building rose like some great giant, its hulking frame stark in the mists of the weather. Ichigo strode forward unhesitant, and Byakuya was forced to follow with a weary sigh. Settled inside a booth where warm air hugged their skin and stuck the heavy fabric of their shiakshos to their skin, Byakuya sipped the warm liquid, feeling it race through his system like the twining path of a snake. Ichigo looked up from his own clay cup, a content smile on his face. The two regarded the other for a moment before breaking into quiet laughter filled with the amusement of their unfortunate luck. Really, Ichigo, we have to stop meeting in places like this. Aizen chided as he strode out from the ruins of the building they were inspecting. Ichigo had been told by Lisa, that there were reports of strange sightings and flashing lights. Thus he was dispatched to investigate. Aizen was cool and collected, intrigued Coco eyes flashing from behind specters in the pale shafts of light piercing the crumbling roof. The building was a mess. Though large in size, it spanned a great property, likely the home of a rich lord. Now walls lay in crumbled piles of debris and rafters were left bare, cloaked in flimsy boards of wood. What do you mean, Aizen? Do you perhaps mean decrypted places such as this, cloaked in shadow? Ichigo queried smartly, eyes glancing warily around his surroundings. The air was heavy with a bitter tint on his tongue, making a sick swell of nausea rise in his stomach. Aizen looked how Ichigo felt. No matter how valiantly the man tried to shield his thoughts and emotions behind a mask, Ichigo could see through it. When entering one's mind, it worked both ways, and Ichigo had seen the brilliant mind Aizen possessed perhaps less clearly than what Aizen had seen of Ichigo's own head, but still the memories lingered on the edge of his mind. The brown-haired lieutenant laughed, the sound deep and dark in a way that suggested amusement born not of light material. Letting threads of tentative Reisu scour the place, Ichigo felt discontent at the stagnant Reisu that plagued the place, the familiar foul Reisu of hollows also lingering upon the waves of air. Looking up from where his contemplative gaze had been drawn to the floor, Ichigo saw that Aizen had moved closer, curiosity abundant in his eyes. As always, he asked, "Were you sent here, Ichigo? Or did you stumble upon some new research that led your insatiable curiosity here?" Aizen's tone was slightly mocking, even if genuine affection sometimes bloomed in usually stoic eyes. Ichigo shook his head, long tangerine strands flickering with the movement. He parted his bangs so he could stare into eyes of deep fire and said, "I should be the one asking you that, Aizen. I will say that I am here on a mission, though the details are quite vague in what they entail." Aizen regarded Ichigo warily for a moment before his shoulders straightened in courage and he began to circle the room, sandal-clad feet leaving a resounding clack to echo around the room as he passed what had once surveyed as the large foyer where one might welcome guests. I came on the principle of curiosity. I thought it might be another one of those cases where an experiment had been performed. Aizen held nothing back, blatantly speaking of the experiments that often fascinated him to no end and left Ichigo bored beyond reason the many times the madman had ventured into the topic. Ichigo was also secretly pleased that the man felt no need to hide such things from Ichigo. Now he trusted Ichigo even if it was only a small fraction of his being. Sharing a nod, the two began to stalk towards the staircase set deep against the far wall. Graceful curves rose in an unending spiral going both up towards the many viewing areas and down towards the dark refinement of the basement. They began by heading down where the Reisu was strongest and most potent. Wooden stairs spiraled ominously into the darkness and the two lieutenants traded challenging smiles, trying to push the other first to descend into what waited below. Tired of the childish bickering, however silent, Ichigo sighed and began to creep down the stairs. They creaked and groaned under the lightest touch, old and rickety in a way that made Ichigo doubt their capability of supporting his weight for long. Dully in the background of his mind, Ichigo acknowledged the sounds of Aizen following him. Far louder and obtrusive than the pale pad of Ichigo's feet, it was to be expected. The lieutenant had never been trained in the ways of the Onmitsukido. Instincts to preserve silence ingrained in one's being and the crispness and cruelty of training resounding in his mind. Light soon reached his eyes and Ichigo blinked frequently, trying to adjust to the sudden burst of light that illuminated the pale shades of the large open room below. Overhead lights flickered ominously, powered by Reisu. Ichigo reached out trying to trace whose Reisu, but he could find none, the creator of such long gone, and with it any sign of their presence. Spread out before them in sickly hues of green was a lab. Dividers portioned some sections off but the rest was left open. A plethora of metal objects twisted like living nightmares were suspended in the room, glowing wickedly in false lighting. The soft beep of machines permeated Ichigo's ears and he stopped as dull shuffling soon accompanied the sound. Crouching, Ichigo blindly reached behind him and snatched the lieutenant's wide hand, pulling him down to a crouch beside Ichigo. A creature of pale white lumbered past them, its figure akin to that of a hollow but with more to it. Its Reisu was twisted in a way Ichigo hadn't experienced since the Winter War and the middle of the Blood War. The creature soon shuffled out of sight, pausing briefly to scent the air, casting a suspicious gaze around the laboratory before it continued on its rounds. Taking the last few steps, Ichigo stepped onto smooth wood. A peculiar sensation seemed to cling to his feet as he touched the ground. Shaking away uncertainty, Ichigo filed it at the back of his mind and stalked forward. Aizen paused at the stairwell, his gaze became contemplative. He slowly began to follow after the orangutan, eyes alight with curiosity. The brown-haired lieutenant glanced at the walls, shuddering in their mortar and thick sheets of paper molded and yellowed with age pinned to wooden frames. The two lieutenants separated, both casting off in different directions to assess and look at the many objects hidden in simple places or within complex puzzles. Ichigo shuddered at the many layered diagrams, recognizing many of the inventions and devices of Aizen's hand. His mind whirled, wondering if all of Aizen's creations had come from within this lab cloaked in shadows. No, the man was far too intelligent to base all inventions off what Ichigo had seen. Stumbling upon a small journal placed beside a large steel box, Ichigo carefully lifted the crumbling leather-bound book. Inside, a mess of writing sprawled across the pages, cramped and hidden occasionally by blots of ink. The writing seemed familiar, and some distant part of Ichigo's mind shuddered at the implications before he turned his attention to the tome in his hands. Flipping through the pages, Ichigo assessed a variety of languages ranging from Latin to Japanese. With varying levels of difficulty, Ichigo decoded the languages, fluent in reading some, and trying to recall passages from the many archive books for others. Before he could continue, Aizen's Reisu spiked with alarm and drew Ichigo's attention. He hastily dropped the book on the desk and flash-stepped to where the lieutenant was sequestered in one corner of the lab. Arriving with a huff, Ichigo's eyes were overwhelmed with the color blue. It seemed to radiate and pulse, covering all surfaces in its folds. Aizen was a shadow in front of a large rack of tubes stretching from floor to ceiling, situated alongside each other. Drawing closer, indistinct figures made themselves visible, floating in a fluid that glowed pale blue, likely the source of light illuminating the walls. Ichigo let out a shocked puff of air as the figures became clear, 8 souls suspended within the water attached to a miasma of tubes. Masks covered their faces, but that was not all that attracted Ichigo's attention. White sprouted from their limbs and torsos in varying degrees of growth and number. As Ichigo drew closer he could see crimson and ebony lines tracing their bodies. With dull horror Ichigo realized that these were holofication experiments done on souls. They were incomplete and the test subjects were likely beyond living, unable to pass on as their souls remained suspended in time. Turning to glance at Aizen, Ichigo could see a mix of emotions swelling in Coco orbs ranging from horror, shock, and sympathy to intrigue, curiosity, and manic glee. Curling his hands into fist, Ichigo took a breath, basking in Zanjutsu's calming Reisu even as Shiro hissed bloodlust prominent in the Shinigami/hollow portions of his power. Aizen turned slowly as if tearing his eyes away from the sight was painful or a difficult task. His coffee orbs connected with Ichigo's eyes and silence pervaded as they stared into each other's souls. "Ichigo, do you have any idea what this is?" Aizen asked, his voice a whisper in the dank lab, shattering the careful silence and tensing Ichigo's senses. Running a hand through tangerine locks in slight frustration at the situation at hand, Ichigo turned his head to glance at the desk resting innocently against the far wall, a stack of papers casually leaning on the desk. "It's holofication, Aizen. The process of dissolving the boundaries between hollow and soul." Aizen stared at Ichigo, obviously not expecting Ichigo to know of the travesty before them, nor did he expect the bitter tone Ichigo's voice had taken. Ichigo's eyes shone with frustration and jaded bitterness. Making his decision, Ichigo stalked towards the far wall where a mess of wires were plugged into a large electrical circuit, the likes of which spanned the whole wall. Ichigo stopped at the wall, sharing a glance with Aizen, challenging him to stop what he could clearly see Ichigo was planning. The man stared, lost for a moment, indecision weighing heavily on his heart. With a shuddering heave he nodded, allowing Ichigo to continue, not that the Oranget wouldn't without Aizen's permission. With a great spark of his Reisu the circuit was fried, sparks flying through the air catching on Ichigo's hair and clothing as he stood illuminated by the light of the dying electricity. Aizen was awed by the sight, staring at the figure bathed in luminescence as sparks raged around him and blue light coiled around his form. The lieutenant swore he could see wisps of Reisu curling around Ichigo's form, shades of crimson mixed with alabaster. As the light died down, the tubes containing the holofied souls flickered off one by one. Aizen's ever-curious mind wondered of the prospect of performing the experiment on those with an inner world otherwise known as Shinigami. Before his thought process could continue, a roar cut through the air, striking the instincts of the two Shinigami. Alert, Ichigo dashed forward, grabbing Aizen's hand. He led the man through the maze of experiments. A few times they nearly tripped over a sprawl of cables or stray pieces of scrap metal. Always the figure lurked behind them, drawing nearer. As they skittered into an open area, Ichigo stopped, turning to face the lumbering beast. Aizen regarded him ludicrously, obviously questioning his sanity in facing a beast of unknown strength and powers. Ichigo turned, a smirk light on his face and eyes alight with bitterness and glee in equal measures. The creature entered the area and both were shocked to see its true height. It was massive, towering over their heads with long beefy arms and thick stocky legs. Its torso was a map of spikes, and the hole that marked it as a hollow was wide and deep. Its mask was large with two horns protruding from the front and back, its beady eyes crimson instead of feral yellow. Roaring, the beast stomped its legs like a bull might and prepared to charge. Turning to face Aizen halfway, Ichigo yelled, "Hide, I'll deal with it." "Go. You'll only get in my way at the moment." Aizen wanted to protest Ichigo's words, but the command of his voice and power in his eyes convinced the chocolate-haired man to obey. With a nod he darted to the side, watching from behind the broken segment of a wall divider. With slow-drawn movements and the hiss of metal against scabbard, Zanjutsu was drawn, the metal glinting in the pale lighting flickering overhead. Ichigo took in a breath, pushing down nausea and nostalgia that swarmed his mind and choked his senses. These hollows were far too familiar. He had seen them many times during the Winter War, a creation of Aizen, modified more so than the beast in front of him. They had appeared again in the Blood War, set loose from whatever hell they had resided in. Their great strength and resistance to dying had proved troublesome on more than one occasion. The hollow looked down on Ichigo, crimson eyes flashing. Ichigo smirked, Shiro's bloodlust thrumming through his veins and casting his eyes golden. With an ear-shattering roar, the hollow charged, swinging large fists in an attempt to smash Ichigo. With easy grace, Ichigo leapt out of the way, using a quick flash step to appear in front of the creature's mask. He slashed down, trying to sever the mask. A large arm came up to block the attack, sharp spikes jutting out, trying to pierce Ichigo. One scraped his cheek and another attempted to gut him, but his arrow was already working and the attack brushed uselessly against his skin. The arm fell with a thump to the ground, raising dust from the lab floor. Enraged, the creature charged forward. Zanjutsu flashed out the blade, stopping the creature in its tracks as a ripple of Reisu charged forward, a low-powered Getsuga Tensho. His Reisu cut through the hollow, separating its torso in half. Easily the hollow reattached itself, the skin stretching and bubbling in its motions. Charging forward, blade glowing and pulsing with Reisu, Ichigo sliced downwards through the bone mask, feeling it shatter beneath his will. Springing back, Ichigo threw up a quick ward behind him, shielding Aizen from the resounding blast of Reisu. The hollow roared, stumbling back, its body pulsed with crimson Reisu before it exploded outwards. Ichigo stood firm against the wave of Reisu, hair, and Shiakusho billowing wildly as it wrecked and crashed against the surrounding lab, tossing paper and metal every which way. Shaking slightly, Ichigo took a breath, calming raging instincts and an unsteady heart. Turning, Ichigo let the barrier fall so that Aizen could reveal himself. The lieutenant peeked out from behind the wall before he stepped out, eyes wide with surprise. He assessed Ichigo, taking in the small cut on the orangette's cheek, weeping a thin trail of blood. The two stared into each other's eyes for a moment before Ichigo spoke. "Come, we should leave this place." Aizen stared for a moment, pensive, before he nodded. Together the two exited the dilapidated building to feel rain smattering their skin and wind billowing in fierce gales about them. Ichigo stared at the building before him and thought he couldn't leave this building standing. It would draw the eyes of Aizen again. His insatiable curiosity would lead him to investigate. If not that, then whatever experiments resided within its broken shell could escape brining havoc upon Soul Society. "Stand back!" Ichigo commanded, turning to Aizen with caramel eyes blazing with determination and the wrath of the heavens. The man stared thoughtful at Ichigo, contemplating defying his words before with a nod the lieutenant of the 5th stepped back a few paces, leaving Ichigo a solemn figure in the rain. Channeling his Reisu, Ichigo raised his hand, ebony and ivory swirling around his hand, vibrant in the rain. Aizen stared in fascination. With wordless power, Ichigo let his Reisu flow forward in a great wave. It slammed into the house, lighting the wood on fire and melting all metal before its power. The fire roared and crackled, accompanied by the sounds of breaking glass, snapping metal, sparks of electricity, and the charred, tainted smell of hollows. Turning to face Aizen, illuminated by the harsh glow of the fire and the collapse of rain around him, Ichigo strode towards the enigmatic lieutenant. "Why did you do that?" Aizen questioned, frowning at his own uncertainty. A bubble of emotions frothed in his eyes and the megalomaniac looked confused. Ichigo sighed. He was confusing the Aizen of his time with this Aizen, younger, less jaded and far less insane. Duly, Ichigo acknowledged that this Aizen was already different. He was not planning the hollowification of the Vizard because he sought to cripple Soul Society. No, he was merely curious. Like a child following the examples of a parent, ever curious at the world around him. Even his bonds with Kaname and Jin were weak. They followed him, seeing the power and loyalty he inspired to those of the same kin. Ichigo would show the man the truth of his actions, draw him towards the light. Aizen would have to walk the rest of the way himself. Running a hand through soaked strands, Ichigo let his Reisu pulse around his form. In the pale night of rainfall, he said, "What dwelled in that building was inhumane experiments, the like of which you are inspired by. Don't deny it. You would surely go back there if the structure was left standing. You understand nothing, Aizen, of morality and consequence. Power you have along with intelligence, oh do you wield it? But you are still blind. Your glasses help you see naught but what you wish. You want to see Soul Society as corrupt and broken with no way to be fixed when they are stuck in their traditions. Change is coming. Your next experiment, perhaps your greatest, will show you more than you think. I've seen what you've done. I know that you've been inspired. You've only begun dabbling. And yourself, Ichigo. Proud being hidden behind a facade, no one sees your soul. Soul Society is trouble indeed, and I see no aid, but for now I content myself with passing follies. You are an enigma, Ichigo, one that understands more than they should. Who are you to lecture me of morality when with ease you burn what could have been foundings incomprehensible?" Aizen yelled back, the two drenched in the rain staring at each other, Reisu curling around their forms. Ichigo huffed, frustrated, and replied, "There was nothing of value in there, only experiments that would set us back, the wanderings of a madman. You don't understand consequence. What you do has repercussions. All those souls you've killed in the few experiments you've performed had families. You could turn your genius to bettering Soul Society, yet still you remain bitter. You say nothing has been done to improve. Change is coming and you will be a conductor of it. Whether you live long enough to see it is up to you." They charged forward at the same time, blades interlocking with a fierce ring of metal clashing upon metal. Reisu raged, shifting the land around them, flattening it and raising rubble to suspend in the air. Across their blades emotions and thoughts were channeled, the two wielders locked, staring into the other's eyes. Aizen stared back and muttered, "Why you, it can't be." It seemed Aizen had recognized the powerful Reisu floating across his senses. Ichigo laughed mirthlessly, thinking of black bandages and the sense of right that accompanied him when he achieved that form. "I will answer your question, Aizen. Who am I? A man determined to protect his family no matter the costs. I will defeat all who stand in my way. You don't understand everything yet, but in time you will know this. Soon you will have to make a decision, and what you choose predicts whether you live or die by my hands." Aizen stared before he sprung back, sheathing Kyoka Suijutsu. His eyes were wide, uncomprehending as Ichigo's words resonated in his mind. The genius was trying to understand the ultimatum issued by Ichigo. Ichigo turned, knowing their scheduled meeting a week from now over tea would still commence. Ichigo felt Koko eyes on his back as he began to move away. The lieutenant of the 5th called out, "Ichigo, how will I know when this decision comes?" Ichigo turned at the foot of the path and called out, "You'll know, Aizen. It will be glaringly obvious, considering I will offer it to you myself." With those parting words, Ichigo fled the scene, where rain surrounded the lieutenant, a bubble of emotions frothing under Aizen's skin just as fire cracked and burned all that remained of the ruins of some great experiment. Ichigo stumbled against a tree once he was out of sight, breathing heavy and hands trembling. He wondered if his efforts to aid Aizen were for naught. The press of Zanjutsu against his mind soothed Ichigo, and he took a deep breath before continuing. X. Chapter 18, Anagnorisis. X. The night was tense, the silence thick and heavy in the atmosphere. As Aizen glanced around the clearing, the captains and lieutenants drawn into his experiment were curled upon the ground around him. White bubbled from them, covering their faces in bone-white masks and rippling around their bodies. A grim satisfaction at the terror he'd inflicted sparked in Aizen's system, and a chilling smile slipped across his face. Reisu sparked across his senses, faint and dim in a way that suggested cloaking and years of training. The faint push of the wind and Kyoka Suijutsu's whispers of all that hid in night's caress drew his eyes to the far side of the clearing. A ripple of air, and from the cover of trees menacing in the cold light of the moon, Kisuk walked forward, cloaked in the same coat that hid all Reisu from his senses. The Kido Corps captain was as silent as ever, his Reisu seemingly nothing. So Kisuk Urahara and Tessai Tsukabishi had come to confront him. It made sense that the captain of the 12th had figured out Aizen's plot. He didn't give the blonde-haired captain enough credit. A tenseness coiled in the air, ready to snap at a hair's breadth. Eyes of cool gray stared into Aizen's own, challenging and accusing in a complicated mixture where grief and guilt lurked in the background. The two locked eyes, the moment held in time for an eternity before another presence made itself known. The hollow-eyed Shinigami, who had been struggling, pitiful moans splitting the air, stilled all motion, ceasing, and tenseness struck the three figures in the clearing. The Reisu was dark and instinctual and achingly familiar. Ebony Reisu creeped along the ground, crawling along painted eaves and caressing still forms. It writhed and curled in on itself before the owner made himself visible. Aizen recognized the Reisu both in color, for where else had he seen such darkness untainted, and feel, yet it was different this time, changed from the figure cloaked in the clearing on that eve long ago. The figure that padded forward had all too familiar orange hair curling along his back and resting on his shoulders. What drew their attention was the catch of light on a mask, bone white, in Ichigo's hands. He stopped before the three Shinigami, grim and silent, though fire sparked in his eyes. Aizen couldn't help but stare, contemplating this revelation, but also Ichigo's appearance. He was far different from the last time either of the two geniuses had seen him. Ichigo's already pale pallor was the color of death itself, his features gaunt and stark in harsh lighting. A weight hung on his shoulders and head, bowing them however slight, and his eyes were the worst of all. Amber orbs were swathed in ache and weariness. If the purple under them was any indication, he likely hadn't slept well. Honestly, the young man looked like shit. Both Kisuk and Aizen winced at the shared sentiment, all animosity forgotten for a moment as they shared knowing glances. It seemed no matter what divided them, they both had gotten to know the eccentric orangutan and grown fond of him. "Good evening," Ichigo intoned hoarsely yet simply, as if his comrades and friends were not suffering on the ground near him. His hands were shaking. Aizen noted, watching the way they curled and uncurled into fists as he tried to think of an answer to Ichigo's words. "I wouldn't necessarily call this pleasant, Ichi, considering our comrades are plastered on the floor hollow-eyed." Kisuk beat Aizen to it, speaking with the easy nonchalance and tip of the hat ambiguity he had perfected over the years. Ichigo cracked a small smile at the humor. It was broken and something dark twisted in Ichigo's eyes, but it was a smile. Ichigo nodded, turning slightly to survey the clearing, his Reisu still snaking from his form. It began to draw closer to the three Shinigami still standing. He turned to face them, a lost expression on his face. I was prepared, but this is still damn hard. Ichigo mumbled under his breath loud enough that their collective figures could hear the harsh words. Aizen coughed and spoke, Ichigo, why are you here? Aizen questioned, wanting to know the reason Ichigo had appeared. If only to taunt and watch the proceedings, then he wouldn't have interfered. Ichigo turned swiftly to face him, a heavy gaze piercing Aizen's soul. Bitter laughter filled the air before Ichigo turned, regaining control of himself. His voice lilted upon the breeze as he said, why am I here? To offer you a choice, Aizen. To provide salvation. Ichigo turned and in slow deliberate movements raised the mask to his face, settling it firmly on his features. Once amber eyes were now feral yellow, staring from a sea of black. But they were Ichigo's eyes, haunting and strange as they were. Kisuke's katana was loosed in its sheath and Tessai raised his hands, but Aizen remained still, mind a whirring clockwork of gears as he comprehended Ichigo's meaning. Before any could question him, the young lieutenant continued. The matter at hand is complicated and the situation dire. What has been done cannot be reversed, and left to their own devices they will shun their soul. I can aid them and I will. The question is extended to you, Aizen, as much as Kisuke detests what you have done, and however likely they will hate you if you run, there will be no place that their blades won't eventually find. If you stay, aid them in recovering, take the so-called gauntlet you propose, change. Already your soul tears in half, reveling in the feel of terror and the succession of an experiment, even as the other half cries at such pain. You don't have to choose between the two halves of your being. But you don't understand, it never will, and you can't repress them anymore. Here is the ultimatum, what shapes all our futures. For if you flee now, Aizen, you control whether these beings live or die, and if you remain, you stay my blade from tasting your blood this night. They all stared at Ichigo, his dual-tone voice echoing in their heads. Tense silence filled the air, and it seemed a moment before the fragile hourglass would shatter. Aizen, coffee eyes wide, needing a distraction from the catastrophe of his mind, jumping from question to question, whispered in shock, but I've scanned your Reisu, it showed only Shinigami. Ichigo turned, a cruel smile appearing on the bone mask before he reached up and took it off, letting it rest easily on top of his head, stark against bright tangerine strands. His gaze challenged the two scientists to scan his Reisu. Tentatively Aizen's Reisu reached out. He recoiled in shock, eyes wide, staring at Ichigo. The only presence of hollow radiated from the mask, resting in tousled strands. Even before, Ichigo's Reisu had been pungent with the feel, but now it was the same as any other time they met. How? Kisuke murmured, curiosity shining in tense gray eyes. Ichigo shook his head, eyes bright. For a moment his gaze landed on the two and he said, I have mysteries wrapped within my skin that none shall see. Whether you see any and understand depends all on yourself. A glance was sent his way indicating that Ichigo wished for a response. Aizen turned from the group, walking a few paces so he could think in peace. Here was the choice he had agonized over since that night at the mansion where fire had flown and blades had clashed. The soul and will in Ichigo's blade was enough to take Aizen's breath away. The choice seemed so simple put in words: stay and aid the hollow-fied Shinigami, repent for his ways, or leave Soul Society to whatever devices of his own making where he could experiment freely but would soon meet Ichigo's blade. His ever-cunning mind traced Ichigo's words repeatedly, easily noting that the young man had never indicated that Aizen serve Soul Society or relinquish his ways. No, Ichigo merely asked that Aizen understand and feel remorse, see how he had touched these people and help them. Looking back briefly, Aizen caught Ichigo's eyes, their thoughts conveyed in one glance. Aizen turned back, coffee eyes staring far ahead into shaded foliage. Ichigo was not an idiot. In fact, if Aizen was being honest, the boy was close to genius, so those words had been meant to the last detail. Ichigo was offering freedom of a different kind, and Aizen had to wonder, did he want to stay? He could leave the mystery Ichigo presented always haunting him along with the Orangette's thin countenance, or he could stay, broaden both mind and soul. The choice seemed easy put so simply, and yet he hesitated. Kyoka Suijutsu whispered in his mind. Her presence calm and the voice of reason, even as tremulous thoughts clashed together. Turning, Aizen paced back and nodded, eyes flicking up to catch caramel orbs. They were filled with joy and relief, and Aizen realized that Ichigo wouldn't have hesitated in killing him. Zanjutsu would have cleaved the air with ease before slicing into him. Ichigo was the man who had killed not for pleasure but because he had to, and he would do so again. It was evident within the fires of his soul, and Aizen wondered how much blood lay on his hands. So, you've recruited our would-be executioner Ichi, what's the plan? Kisuke broke the still silence that had fallen over them with easy words, silver eyes peeking from beneath the cowl of his hood and the tangle of blonde locks. Ichigo looked at the bone mask in his head in thought, watching as it dissolved, pieces drifting away on a sudden wind. The orangutan sighed, running a hand through orange strands tangling them. He turned to Kisuke and said, "They will soon notice the missing captains. The Suteiko is covered and I can deal with Central 46. They will need at least a month to train. We will need a place with wide open spaces that is hidden, preferably with no one knowing about it." Ichigo smirked knowingly at the end of his sentence. Kisuke paled before nodding, and Aizen could only wonder at Ichigo's plans already thought out before he nodded his accordance to the plan born on the whims of night. Ichigo sighed before he padded over to one of the hollow-fied Shinigami. He slung the figure over his shoulder with ease. Turning to look at the three assembled Shinigami, he threw a soft grin, still broken and eyes full of darkness. He called out, "We're going to have to move them somehow. I can only keep them sedated for so long." With a sigh, Aizen shook his head and began walking towards one of the sprawled figures, wondering what he had gotten himself into. Two paths had lain before him, one shrouded in darkness with a swift end, and this new path covered in swaths of gray with so many twists Aizen couldn't deduce light from shadow. Kyoka Suijutsu comforted him in his decision, motherly tones of concern echoing along their bonds as she regarded the young Shinigami with sorrowful eyes. Aizen Sosuke was many things and a man was one. This night had brought many revelations, and his heart thudded in his chest in time with the chaotic thoughts of his mind, but he understood the cause. Ichigo Shiba, the very present enigma that deepened every time he saw him. Time would only tell what next would be revealed. Ichigo walked into the council room of the Central 46 with fury in his posture and fire in his eyes. Yamamoto, who he had spoken to of all that had trespassed the night before, was seated in the corner, eyes smoldering and intent on Ichigo. Coming to a stop in the center of the room, Ichigo stared up at the senile old fools. Maliciousness haunted their eyes and twisted already waxen and shriveled figures gruesome in harsh candlelight. The Suteiko had informed the Godi I-13 of what had passed in a quick and easy manner, simply stating that the victims of the incident were being trained to accommodate their new powers and responsibilities, and that they would be welcome within Soul Society no matter of their circumstances. When Aizen heard the news, he had swung on Ichigo and smiled in a way Ichigo had never seen. It tickled his nerves, and the pride and hope that sparked in Coffee Orbs was enough for Ichigo to be happy for the moment with all he had done. Of course, the old geezers weren't going to accept such an atrocity to occur, nor for such freaks to walk Soul Society's prestigious and pure halls. It was useless propaganda, and Ichigo bitterly remarked that they still had too much power even with what Yamamoto had managed to snatch from greedy clawed hands. This would take some of the power from those hands, and Ichigo would get the vindictive pleasure of being the cause of their defeat. It was strangely nostalgic standing in that room where he had stood many times before, though as the war passed on they were relied on less and less. Of course, he would always remember his own trial before them, cold eyes in a swift unjust sentence. As much as he protected and preferred to think of the Soul Society of his past in kind light, Ichigo was sometimes forced to acknowledge that they did indeed have faults. For how did one justify the death of an entire race? Shrugging the thoughts from his mind, Ichigo remained resolute and firm as mutters and whispers filled the air. After all, he was the famous Shiba who had outsmarted his elders with ease and would not take their words lying down. The chatter went on and on, trying to encourage a reaction from Ichigo, who stood still as stone, mind drawing to their arrival at the training grounds of Kisuke and Yorichi's childhood. The wizard had yet to awake from the slumber Ichigo had easily induced. For now Kisuke was experimenting with the Hogyaka, looking at Ichigo's own notes and theories. He had been skeptical when he took them, before he flipped open the small booklet to see messy scrawl and a horde of diagrams. Aizen had conferred with the scientist for a quiet moment. The tension and animosity that inhabited the air between them dimmed somewhat after their chat, and Ichigo was sure he heard his name more than a few times. The silence finally died down to the amused snark of Shiro. Ichigo smiled pleasantly, or what passed for it, though the keen sharpness of a predator underlay it. Their petty tactics of trying to anger him and being disrespectful by making him wait would get them nowhere. With the sharpness of wood against stone, the man at the head of the podium began to speak. He was bald with more wrinkles than a turtle and a voice that grated on your nerves. He questioned the safety of the wizard, the science, the training, among a million other questions that Ichigo answered with ease, slipping in cleverly disguised insults with a fluid grace. Shiro cheered in the back of his mind even as amusement radiated from Zanjitsu. Ichigo could sense the Aiken emotion resonating from the bearded Suteiko. On and on the questions continued, seemingly endless, drawing on Ichigo's patience until he assumed it was the opportune moment to strike back. Are Central 46 so incompetent that you must repeat the same simple questions over and over again, expecting different answers that suit your own needs? You senile fools are useless. Time spent here could have easily been spent in the presence of the victims, aiding them. Instead you insist on trying to stop this operation. You insist these Shinigami will be fearful a danger to us all when I have provided credited sources in my own research to counter such reasoning. It is the moral of a fool to continue even after they have been so thoroughly denounced. Central 46, you have proven this council useless. What do you achieve? Even now the commerce of equality pushes forward in advancing the state of Rungokai, even the Suteiko has stepped forward when you have been neglectful. This council thinks its seats ancient and an honor to all who stand to be in their presence. Such falsehood is laughable. Soul Society stood long before you and it will stand long after you. Give up this vengeful and simple-minded challenge or waste away what power you have. But know that they will be accepted in Soul Society no matter how much propaganda you spread. Shaking away the anger that clung to his form in tendrils of ebony, Reisu Ichigo turned from the doors, nodding briefly to the Suteiko before he swept from the room, orange locks flying behind his head, tailing the shocked silence of the council room. He awoke disoriented, and Shinji easily could amiss the feelings and soreness that plagued his body to a hollow fight or training with Hiyori, and then his mind caught up with his body and the cool mask that rested on his features was yanked off in a rush and held in his hands. Dark sockets stared up at him, empty and accusing. Her wrathful voice echoed in his mind, and Shinji wondered if his whole world had been tipped upside down, much like Sakonda's powers. Orange appeared in his vision just as darkness like a cloud seemed to descend on his mind, a crushing depression that was ripping into his soul as much as Sakonda's pain. Chocolate eyes so full of warmth and soulful fire gazed into his own, and it took Shinji but a moment to place those eyes as Ichigo Shiba's. Confusion still prevalent throughout, the dizzying vertigo of his awakening returned in full force, and Shinji tipped forward slightly uncertain. Ichigo's warm hands met his shoulders, pushing the captain up so he could look into those eyes. Blonde strands hung like a curtain between the two, blocking out the world that had turned its back on him. Looking down at Ichigo's prompting, Shinji watched in mounting confusion as a bone mask formed in his pale, scarred hands. It was all to remnant of a hollow like the mask held in his own hands. Ichigo pushed back Shinji's locks and belayed the kid's age. It was the tenderness of a mother with her child. Shinji wondered where Ichigo found it within himself, such light when darkness even now cloaked rich amber orbs. Turning his head to the side so as to observe their surroundings, Shinji could see some of his comrades, victims of the tragedy that had occurred, resting on mats in what appeared a small alcove. Turning his head to the other side, Shinji spotted the others and the opening to a larger complex where the sky was blue as any summer's day and spires of rock rose into the distance. It all felt so much, his emotions welled under his skin, confusion ran rampant, pain engulfed him, and Shinji just wanted it to be over, whatever it was. Ichigo frowned, the look familiar on the orangutan before he leaned in closer, his voice a bare whisper of the empty wind. You are not alone, you are not deserted. Can you stand? The words were said with such conviction they teared what remained of his heart to shreds. He stared into those soulful eyes full of promise and hesitantly nodded, grimacing at the sharp pound of his head received for the movement. With Ichigo's aid and many a curse from his lips, Shinji was able to wobble to his feet, shaky and unsure. He studied his surroundings once more. Ichigo's Reisu curled around his form, soothing the ache of his muscles and calming the incessant shaking that was plaguing him. Hungry? Ichigo queried easily. Shinji wondered if he was over the pain of his head. Roughly he nodded, and the orangutan smiled, leading the two in a small movement like a jig further into the alcove where it branched into different sectors and hallways. Ichigo confidently turned down one that looked the same as any other, the two continuing their shuffle until they reached another room. Kisuke was sitting at a table, a steaming cup of tea curled in his palms and morose thoughtfulness on his features. Tessai was hovering in the kitchen watching a few things on the stove, even as keen eyes surveyed the room. It was then Shinji noticed Aizen's presence. To Ichigo's muttered, "Shit." Rage seemed to coil in his form, Sakonda's words growing louder and more horrendous. He felt what control he had of his body slipping away until a small pinch on his arm and warm Reisu chased away the fog of his mind. White material fell away from his face, akin to the white of hollow masks. Dully Shinji realized what had occurred even as his mind was running in circles. Looking to Ichigo, Shinji smiled in partial thanks, understanding that his instincts were changed as much as Sakonda was. Ichigo led the two to the low table, ignoring the staring glued to their forms, interest and curiosity heavy in the atmosphere. Ichigo set Shinji down across from Kisuke, who mechanically reached over and poured the still steaming tea into a clay mug before passing it over. The scientist was in his own world, eyes glued to the small notebook in his hands, water-stained and torn as it was. Ichigo bustled into the kitchen, a whirlwind of movement as he tossed some ingredients onto the stove. Tessai stepped back and watched the young orang at work. "You weren't supposed to wait till tomorrow, then again you're more powerful than many of the others." Ichigo mumbled loud enough for Shinji to hear as he continued to prepare the meal. Shinji let his eyes drift over the area, trying to draw them away from Aizen. Looking at the genius brought fire bubbling in his veins and wrath upon his mind. Ichigo continued to bustle around the kitchen, sharp eyes glancing up to assess the situation before flickering back to the meal he was preparing. Expectant silence filled the air and Shinji felt curiosity and confusion continue to wage war within his mind. "What happened?" Shinji finally spoke, breaking the tense peace. Kisuke's metal gray eyes flickered up from the text he was reading, serious and uncertain. They stared at Shinji before he flinched and returned his eyes to the sprawling words. Tessai jerked where he stood in the kitchen, watching the proceedings. Guilt seemed to flash in his eyes before it was shaken away. Aizen looked up, coffee eyes so changed from the years before, caught Shinji's eyes before he turned, looking away with strange emotions bubbling in those eyes. Ichigo flinched, looking like a trapped animal for a sparse second before aggressively he ran his hand through his hair, eyes alight like a tremulous storm. The young man stopped pacing and looked at Shinji, eyes heavy and hot like the heat of Ryujinjaka. Shinji's breath caught in his throat at the sorrow displayed there. Ichigo sighed once more, gaze swerving to look at his accomplices before he spoke. "You were hollow-fied. The process in which the boundary between soul and hollow is destroyed. Thus, your Zanpakuto was hollow-fied, and now within you is the powers of a hollow even while you remain a Shinigami." Shinji's eyes widened and he stared in disbelief, trying to process words slow and heavy as if Ichigo struggled to form even the thoughts. Sakanda had been hollow-fied, that was the reason for her pain and the screams that even now raged inside his head. It explained the bone mask on his face and the overwhelming rage that bubbled beneath his skin. Tentatively he felt his own Reisu wincing at the sharp taint of hollow present, even as it mixed and swelled with Shinigami, creating something altogether new. Looking up as questions spiked in his mind, Shinji asked, "Ya said I wasn't alone, I don't think ya mean the others." Ichigo nodded even as he cursed. Curious eyes now rested on the orangutan, and with some reluctance he continued to prepare the meal, eyes distant, lost in the bowels of his mind. With a rough sigh the young lieutenant spoke, "My own soul was hollow-fied, though perhaps differently from yours." Finishing those words, Ichigo reached up and in a smooth motion his fist was covered with ebony Reisu, clashing with crimson. He drew it over his face. Resting on his features was a mask of bone white with lines of harsh red and black trailing from the sockets and running along the jaw. The eyes were the most prominent feature, feral gold peeking out from darkness, somehow still Ichigo's eyes. Shinji's Reisu tentatively traced out to brush against Ichigo, surprised to find a similar mix of Reisu not present when Shinji had woken. "How?" Shinji questioned, knowing that Ichigo had not suffered at the hands of Aizen with the rest of them. His experience and knowledge said differently. With his question, all eyes in the room swung to Ichigo, and the man flinched at the attention, his familiar tic presenting itself as he ran a hand through orange locks. "My hollow is of my parentage and circumstances. My soul chain was cut, and to save a friend I underwent training to regain my powers. For one such task I was dropped into a hole. The only way to escape was to regain my lost powers. The trick of the matter is that done too late one's Zanpakuto can hollow-fee as you tempt the balance between hollow and Shinigami. I've had many years with Shiro and have come to understand more than most on the matter." Ichigo's eyes were swimming with nostalgia and loss, his gaze distant as if he wasn't even in the room anymore, mind treading familiar paths. Kisuke and Aizen shared glances filled not with animosity and challenge as Shinji had seen many times before. Now their gaze was knowing, flicking towards the young Shinigami who had methodically began cooking the meal again. Silence filled the room, accompanied only by the dull sound of the knife hitting a cutting board. Shinji closed his eyes, centering himself. He looked inside at his Reisu and at Sakanda. She was furious, her beautiful form now sporting white additions. It didn't demote her beauty any less, but Shinji refrained from speaking, simply watching his Zanpakuto with sorrow, feeling their once strong bond shiver suddenly fragile. A cough pulled Shinji from his thoughts and he looked up to see Ichigo setting a plate down before him. The food was simple but looked delicious to his more than weary mind, so he inclined his head in thanks and began eating. The food was amazing. Shinji's eyes whipped to stare at Ichigo as he offered some to the other occupants of the room. Kisuke accepted or rather mumbled something too focused on the work in his hands. Tessai nodded easily taking the proffered food with a smile, and Aizen tried to deny it but was met with Ichigo's pointed stare and he reluctantly accepted. Shinji smirked at that. No one could resist Ichigo's fierce determination and care. Ichigo returned to the kitchen for a few moments before he stalked over and plopped in the seat next to Shinji between Kisuke. The scientist looked up then looked to his book before his gaze rose once more assessing the orangutan who was sprawled in the chair. Ichigo ran a hand through his hair with a heavy sigh and Kisuke placed the worn journal down for a second looking to Ichigo with concern in grey eyes he said, "Your research on the matter is very in-depth Ichigo frankly it's astounding and far beyond what I would have thought of." Ichigo let out a non-committal hum closing his eyes and tipping back his head. It was there Shinji noticed the deep purple under closed eyelids and the paleness that clung to Ichigo's skin like that of the sickly. Kisuke frowned and continued, "Were the senile old fools that bad?" Ichigo opened his eyes, weary and dark in the lighting of the cave. Shinji frowned, instincts newly awakened curled within in his chest and he forcefully had to clamp down on the urge to comfort the young lieutenant. Rubbing a hand over his eyes Ichigo spoke, "Damn bastards as usual, but they refused to see reason no matter how brutal the evidence was. I made them aware that their time and power is swiftly falling. I estimate if they don't take this situation well then, the commerce of equality will likely rise to power. And for the better as they are comprised of souls from all regions and of all stations. They are just too stubborn, refusing to see the truth and honestly Aizen if you tried to kill them I wouldn't stop you." Everyone's eyes were centered on Ichigo as he finished his last sentence. It seemed unlike Ichigo to say such brash and blunt things but then rationality kicked in and Shinji remarked that Ichigo would likely aid the insane bastard. What Ichigo was saying did have merits and Shinji supposed he had gone in front of the useless fools to speak about them. The commerce of equality was new but he vaguely remembered hearing about it from the members of his division. Turning to cast his gaze at Aizen Shinji noted a pleased smirk on his lieutenant's features the man obviously imagining the scenarios. Turning back to face Ichigo he saw that the young man was resting his head in his hands. He looked up to meet Shinji's gaze with a tired smile before he leaned back resting on the palms of his hands. "Ichigo you mentioned the name Shiro earlier when talking about your hollow I thought your Zanpakuto's name was Zanjitsu." Reisu spiked in the room at Aizen's question and Ichigo threw a faint glare at the man before he shrugged his shoulders, head tipping back to look at the ceiling a mess of rock above he replied, "Like I said my situation is a bit different than yours but Shiro is." Ichigo paused his head tilting listening to the words of his Zanpakuto. An amused frown tilted across his features, only Ichigo could manage to frown while still looking amused, and his brows furrowed. Ichigo shook his head and continued, "Well it's complicated but I think you'll figure out the answer soon enough." With another shrug Ichigo finished leaving a question unanswered once more and leaving many more at the forefront of Shinji's mind. Kisuke and Aizen traded quick glances and Shinji thought he was beginning to understand the meaning of those gazes as they flicked over to Ichigo who was heaving himself from the seat with a groan before collecting the plates. Shinji's life had been turned upside down and yet some things were still present and the mystery Ichigo presented would likely never be solved. Ichigo paced back and forth to the amusement of the gathered Shinigami. He ran a hand through vibrant orange locks amber eyes flicking to glance at them for a sparse second before drawing away towards the horizon. The terrain of the hidden training area rose around them great spires of rock muted reds and yellows in the artificial sunlight. A faint wind blew through the area picking up dust and tangling hair. Kisuke and Aizen perched in a far corner away from the clearing Ichigo had chosen watched on, curious and intrigued to see the actions of the young lieutenant. Already the past few days had been somewhat revealing and equal parts confusing. The hollow-eyed Shinigami had all woken early yesterday morning under Ichigo's careful watch. He had handled their questions and led them to the kitchen where tea was served. Kisuke had the inane sense of déjà vu as Ichigo went over the same questions Shinji had posed, the blonde a silent and sturdy figure hiding in the shadows providing support. Ichigo had again spoken with hidden meaning near impossible to decipher but it had satisfied the Shinigami for the moment. Now they were gathered to begin training, or they would if Ichigo could muster the courage or whatever he was seeking to stop pacing. As if brought to will by the collective thoughts of the assembled Shinigami, Ichigo paused and let out a heavy sigh before he plopped onto the cool rock below. In one swift move Zanjitsu was resting across his lap, thin tendrils of ebony snaking around the blade. There are many ways to deal with being hollow-eyed, not all of them are correct. It took me many years to find the correct way. We have at least a month to train you all to harmonize with the newfound instincts and powers dwelling inside you. Ichigo's pause did not go unnoticed. Rose regarded the orangutan with a peculiar glance, equally curious and approving, as if seeing the man before him for the first time. Shinji, coiled against a section of rock, regarded the proceedings with Cheshire keen eyes, even as Hiyori stood brooding beside him, likely to release her fury at any given time. Love shifted his gaze to Rose before it traveled around their small group, noting Haki's frown even as the Kido master had hope rekindled in his hands. Lisa's eyes were complex swirls of emotions as she stared at the lieutenant who had stood by her side as they became good friends. She thought she should feel anger at Ichigo's revelation, but only relief coursed through her veins. Seeing a lack of questions, Ichigo ran a hand over the blade before speaking once more. To achieve this you need understand a few details. Your Zanpakuto has been hollowified, but their powers and shape remain the same. You need to find balance between and with your Zanpakuto, as a hollow seeks to dominate those weaker. To show signs of weakness will lead to a struggle for power, and the correct way is not to force your Zanpakuto into submission and lock them away from your thoughts and hearts. You are all relatively experienced Shinigami and thus understand well what the bond between Shinigami and Zanpakuto means. You are taming and learning to control instincts and to harness powers that now rest at your fingertips. How when they scream in pain? Kensei posed the question. Mashiro, seated beside the stoic captain, a sorrowful expression though somewhat rekindled with hope residing on her normally smiling features. Ichigo nodded almost to himself before he sprung up and raised his hand, channeling Reisu until a mask formed. The same mask he had revealed to the shock of all gathered many nights prior, albeit at different times. To settle this soul-deep pain, you will have to battle your Zanpakuto, prove to them your determination and will. Show them that the bond, fragile as thread, will not snap nor remain so. While doing this, the outside world will be dealing with a fully hollowified version of yourself. Instincts will run freely as all barriers your Zanpakuto had been fighting against are released. They were openly gaping at him, or at least the few that had yet to master control of their emotions. Shinji sprung forward from his perch, stalking over to stare into Ichigo's eyes. Even if no vocal confirmation had been voiced, the others looked towards Shinji as the leader of their sudden band of renegades. Ichigo was promising salvation, and Shinji, who had tasted the blade of betrayal and bitterness of failure, was both skeptical and trusting of the young man before him. The mask in Ichigo's hands was lifted between them, black sockets empty yet frightening all the same, stared between the two even as Ichigo held Shinji's gaze. Nodding, the blond man grinned. It was a far cry from the wide curl of his lips, but promising all the same, he said, "And when we achieve harmony." Ichigo laughed, the sound clear in the bare cavern of rock. His soulful eyes scanned the faces of the assembled Shinigami before drawing back to Shinji. He said, "Harmony isn't so easy as a quick mediation. There's kinks and forks in the road, details to pave. Not to mention control. You think one can hold the hollow mask indefinitely? Or summon Zeros to their fingertips? Training will kick your asses and then some, but you'll come forth more than you were before." Ichigo's words were the amusing lilt of sarcasm and endurance, somehow managing to encourage and inspire just as much as to dissuade you from broaching the subject once more. Ichigo looked as if he wanted to continue before his gaze became distant and he entered a one-sided argument with himself. "No. You can't. What will they think? I don't care if you'll behave." Ichigo continued on in the same manner for a minute, to the amused and somewhat puzzled glances of everyone gathered before him. With a heavy sigh he quieted, rolling his shoulders. He looked up and with fond resignation said, "Shiro has politely asked to come out, and considering he would be bitching all night if I said no, I'm going to materialize him." With that quick warning, Ichigo ignored the shock rippling throughout the Shinigami. To materialize one's Zanpakuto was no small feat. It required enormous amounts of Reisu just to sustain the form. There was also the small fact that showing another one's spirit seemed near taboo in Soul Society and was rarely done. All eyes were fixed on Ichigo, doubting this would bring revelations, rather another labyrinth of questions. The air bubbled and popped with tension before Reisu gathered beside Ichigo, forming a being with indistinct features. Slowly the figure solidified and even Aizen was left gaping as Ichigo turned to glare at a near-perfect copy. The doppelganger was inverted, all pale white and simple black, with the feral gold of a hollow in his eyes. The two, twin-like in appearance, scowled at each other for a moment before Ichigo let out a heavy sigh and Shiro smirked. "Damn King, finally letting me free." Shiro's voice held odd dual tones, a deeper rasping voice that seemed to grate against the nerves. Ichigo scoffed and rolled his eyes in exasperation, ignoring the weary caution prevalent in the assembled Shinigami as their hands were drawn to their Zanpakuto. Shaking his head, Ichigo replied, "Yes, and look at the mess of problems this will bring. Ah King, just show them, yeah, don't need to hide us anymore. We're getting bored with the pathetic imitation." Shinji stared, trying to puzzle the overload of information standing before him. Shiro was apparently Ichigo's Zanpakuto spirit, as he had never indicated otherwise, and while it was strange, unheard of and something one could only expect of Ichigo, it wasn't uncommon for Zanpakuto spirits to take unique forms. Then there was their relationship. They were like that of an old married couple, or appeasing their like image, a pair of brothers squabbling. But Shinji could see it was all in good fun, with no hate or bite behind the words, seemingly a well-practiced routine. The title King was also a reflection of Ichigo's own experience with inner hollows, as evident by his declaration relating to subjugating their spirits. Sighing heavily, Shinji observed the other Shinigami, who were staring and watching as the two continued to converse. The amusing sight of Ichigo talking to himself belied somewhat by their surprise. One of the many things that left him wanting to pinch the bridge of his nose in frustration was the hollow-like spirit's words. He referred to it as if there were two spirits in an imitation. His eyes of their own accord drew to the two scientists hunched over, muttering together like a band of thieves. If Ichigo succeeded in anything over this month, it would be uniting the two megalomaniacs. Ichigo coughed, the two having fallen silent after letting the others absorb the sudden influx of twisting revelations that of course simply led to more questions. Ichigo paced a slight distance away from the group, Shiro remaining where the two had once stood, a smirk full of tooth curled on bleached features. He turned to the collected Shinigami and rasped, "Kingi here is going to show ya some of the techniques ya can harness." Ichigo raised one hand, and with a slow breath out, Reisu gathered a swirling supernova of red and black that pulsed and radiated through the air. The wind picked up billowing dust like a storm cloud. With a quiet exhale seeming loud as a peal of thunder in the tense silence, Reisu raged from Ichigo's hands, swirling and rippling uncontained power. The land was decimated with a harsh crash. Debris was sent flying, and Haki quickly threw up a barrier, the large pieces of rock, some more akin to boulders, bouncing against the shield and fracturing it. Chase Zero, an attack in which one harnesses energy into a center point. As the dust cleared and the shield of glowing orange fell, the spirit spoke. The destruction revealed left some of them swimming in surprise. Where once spires rose, a deep hole was gouged into the land and debris collected on all sides. Kisuke frowned, muttering under his breath about Yorichi, even as intrigue lit metal gray eyes. Aizen beside the blonde regarded the chaos of that one attack with eyes both fearful and understanding. Ichigo stalked back towards the group, eyes pulsing with power. The Shinigami seemed a whole different person at that moment, one coiled with raw power in his spine and will in his heart. Then a small unsure smile hesitantly settled on his features, and the image wavered so that they could easily see the Ichigo they had all come to know. Shinji wondered at the incredible power Ichigo displayed. He questioned why the young man had kept such power under wraps. Ichigo stopped beside his spirit, who was now pouting at his wielder even as he tossed a blade of ivory-colored metal to Ichigo. It flashed, catching the eyes of the gathered Shinigami as Ichigo reached up and grabbed the blade and in one swift movement rammed it against his chest, committing what could easily be called seppuku. Time seemed to stop as they surged forward, far too slow to stop the Orangette's movements, and watched in wonder as the blade shattered against Ichigo's chest, no wound visible or the worrying trickle of blood. Ichigo smirked, teasing and taunting as he pulled the hilt away from his chest, the shattered fragments falling to the ground before dispersing. "Damn King, breaking it, yeah, know how that tickles." "What was that, the seventh time?" Ichigo shrugged innocently, as if breaking the blade of his spirit was no small matter. Shiro turned to face the collected Shinigami and continued, "Iero, a technique in which one uses Reisu to enforce or toughen their skin." Shinji absently wished the gears of his mind would start turning again, as he was left in dumbstruck awe and surprise. Whatever the young lieutenant threw at them, Shinji doubted he would ever expect it or be prepared. Lisa looked ready to either slap Ichigo or combust into a small ball, trying to comprehend the enigma before her. Shinji could sympathize, and it looked like Rose was more than ready to pass out. Ichigo's amber eyes flashed to Shinji, assessing the group before him. With a small shrug, he brought the hilt up and drew the sharp, shattered end against the skin of his forearm. Blood welled up from the shallow wound and trickled down Ichigo's arm, falling from his fingers in tiny droplets of crimson. Then white bubbled from the wound, the same bleached white that Shinji had seen bubble on his friends' faces and felt on his own. Within a moment, the white liquid was gone and the wound with it. Nothing to reveal that a wound had ever been there. This time Ichigo spoke, voice soft yet strong in a way that pervaded the air but did not disturb it. We are also able to access instant or accelerated healing. There is a final technique that I won't show as it is doubtful any will achieve it. Resurrection for the Espada is when they release their hollow powers from their sealed blade. For us it would be a form of complete hollowification. This can occur when we are slain, if we have the will to live, or if we succumb to instincts. Ichigo turned to his spirit after he finished speaking and handed the hilt to the spirit, who grinned and took the blade. He turned to the collected Shinigami and said, "Don't think this'll be the last Yasiomi. Take care of King." With a wink and a feral smile the spirit disappeared, drifting away to Ichigo's inner world. Ichigo glared at where his hollow once stood even as the collective Shinigami felt shivers run down their spines at the warning of the spirit. Shinji easily caught the meaning behind the spirit's words. It helped that Shinji was already intent on helping the Oranget, and if the conspicuous glances by the two scientists in the corner were any clue, they were in easy agreement. Ichigo regarded the collected Shinigami and wondered if he should so callously reveal something else while he was on a roll. With a smirk boding nothing well for the wizard in front of him, Ichigo asked, "Well, how about we start? We don't need to try anything too deep today, perhaps a little spar, see how well you can control your instincts. I'll fight two of you." They blanched at Ichigo's nonchalant words as he slung Zanjutsu from his place at Ichigo's side where he sometimes rested. The blade purred in his hands and Ichigo shook his head in amusement at Shiro's glee. Old man Zanjutsu also seemed pleased at the prospect of their imminent release. They had stayed cooped inside their false form in front of others for so long that they hungered to battle against real foes, not invisible steel. Shinji stepped forward, a cocky smile on his face even as his brown eyes were a storm of emotions, confusion and curiosity waging war from underneath the crown of golden locks. There was some indecision among the group before Rose stepped forward, challenge and promise in his eyes. They drew their blades, the sharp hiss of metal upon scabbard grating upon tense nerves and echoing some hidden gong. The others moved back, crouching among pillars of rock and regarding the coming spare with interest. Ichigo could feel Aizen's eyes tracing the blade, could almost see the man's mind running a mile a minute trying to calculate Ichigo's next move or the outcome of the battle. Kisuke was silent beside him, eyes alight with fire from within and a pensive frown on his features. They charged forward, blades swinging against Ichigo. He smirked and deftly flicked Zanjutsu up the blade, already dying ebony with bloodlust and glee, intercepting the two. A contest of strength waged, the two pushing against Zanjutsu just as Ichigo pushed back. Held for a precious moment, they broke apart and blades began to whir through the air like the spinning blades of a chainsaw. Ichigo knew the captains he was facing were talented. They had years upon years of experience with their blades, but that wasn't to say Ichigo wasn't a prodigy with the sword. It was in his blood. He gave as good as he got. The three paced across the open plains, darting near invisible in their speed. Shinji and Rose's attacks gained speed and power as they moved, a recklessness born of instincts strumming in their bones. Ichigo kept at the same pace, Zanjutsu sure in his hands and content with the battle. The two released their Shikai in a blinding flash of Reisu that sent dust spiraling like a small tornado around them. Their voices were almost a dual tone akin to the one Ichigo sported when he donned his mask. Ichigo could see the inner war raging in their souls as they tried to suppress sudden bloodlust and instincts totally new to them. The young Shinigami suspected that if the battle was prolonged their masks would appear. Whether of their control or their spirits was debatable. Narrowly dodging the thin strings of Rose's Shikai, the nauseous sense of his world inverting overtook his senses as the world around them flipped. Taking a breath, Ichigo closed his eyes, well familiar with the art of illusion type Zanpakuto. Shinji whined for a moment, likely pouting, straight gold hair swaying before they were flying forward again. Ichigo remained where he stood, letting instincts guide his hand. He brought Zanjutsu up in a harsh arc, slicing outwards and feeling the pleasing sense of cloth being caught by the black blade. They circled around him like hungry sharks, all thoughts of going easy on the younger and less experienced Shinigami gone from their minds as instincts bit at their nerves. Darting in and out, Ichigo combated each attack with ease, feeling the faint bite of a blade against his cheek. He turned and raised his hands, casting a quick Byakurai in the direction of Rose's Reisu. Shinji's Reisu spiked, the taint of hollow becoming more pronounced. With a smirk of excitement and anticipation, Ichigo brought Zanjutsu's sealed form in front of him. Reisu frothed and channeled along the blade, rising along his form in spiraling arcs of ebony. Tear the heavens asunder, Zanjutsu. The comforting weight of both blades in his hands distracted him for a moment as the Reisu and dust cleared the inverted world broken by the tremendous power Ichigo had tried to contain, released. All movement stopped and Ichigo could feel the piercing eyes of his comrades on the blades in his hands, the ebony metal glinting and catching the light. Zanjutsu's Kyber blade pulsed with blue Reisu and the longer blade representing Shiro swirled with angry red in a familiar cadence. Looking up from the tangle of feathers obscuring his sight, Ichigo glimpsed Shinji and Rose's dumbstruck expressions. They gaped at him incredulously. Lisa looked close to murdering him while Mashiro was excitedly gushing to Kensei. Kisuke, no matter how much he tried to hide it, could not shield the shock from his face. It appeared in his gaping mouth and wide gray eyes. Aizen beside the blonde was not faring much better. A smirk of its own accord curled on Ichigo's features, both in glee at releasing Zanjutsu and the mix of reactions that his blade brought forth. After all, it was supposed that only Jushiro and Shunsui had dual blades, excluding Shunsui, who hadn't even joined the academy as far as Ichigo was aware. Much the same, his blade was also far from the normal saber seen by any Shinigami. It heralded his complex heritage. The wild and reckless curves of his blade, yet hidden within graceful curves, the hollow that represented both Shiro and the gaping hole left inside his soul as the war progressed. Shinji started cackling, doing an excellent impression of the manic laughter that sometimes left his hollow's lips when things became all too chaotic for the bloodthirsty being. The blonde shook his head for a moment, locks swaying frivolously. He said, "Of course, Ichi, yeah, just had to be the one with a dual blade. I'm assuming it's your Shikai." Ichigo nodded, and he could feel Aizen's triumphant smirk forming as the brown-haired Shinigami's suspicions were confirmed. Rose nodded, letting his Zanpakuto whip out in front of him, eyes still holding challenge. His silky voice spoke, "Well, now the playing field is even, shall we continue?" Ichigo merely flicked his blades, sparks of power coiling and bouncing off the metal. Shinji tilted his head and raised Sakanda. They charged forward once more, the air seeming to grow tense and heavy with the pressure of their Reisu. Ichigo suppressed a slightly irritated sigh in the knowledge that even now he could not show the might of his blade. The resounding clash distracted him from reluctant thoughts, and he narrowed caramel eyes. Striking and dodging at the same time, Ichigo twisted to the left, a low-powered Getsuga Tensho surging from the blade in a heady arc of ebony and crimson. It slammed into Shinji, who hastily raised his blade. Rose disappeared from sight even as Ichigo's instincts called warning. He turned, Zanjutsu's larger form rising to catch the thin piano wires gleaming gold. With a tug, the curly blonde was sent flying forward. Zanjutsu's smaller blade peeked up, ready to gut the captain. Rose twisted away at the last second, the bare whisper of a blade on his neck. Ichigo ducked and sent a quick Hado in Rose's direction. White was beginning to bubble on Shinji's faces, and the overtaking ebony in his sclera was an indication that he was losing the battle to his instincts. A low growl sounded from behind him, turning slightly so that he was facing the two captains. Ichigo could see a like image on Rose's own chiseled features. Challenge vibrant in his eyes, their blades came at him with the force of a truck. He easily shouldered the weight, throwing them back. It was time he ended this battle before their Zanpakuto got out of hand. A Getsuga Tensho ripped from his blade, and he darted forward in the following waves of Reisu, striking their blades from their hands in the confusion. With ease, Ichigo slipped behind their guards and pinched a nerve that would temporarily incapacitate them. Bearing their weight, Ichigo sunk to the ground where the eyes of the others had been riveted on the battle above. Lisa's fierce glare was the first thing he saw upon touching ground. Setting the two down, Ichigo apoplectically rubbed the back of his head. He had accomplished more than he thought, but he would now be dealing with a multitude of questions and plenty of accusing stares. X. Chapter 19, Mizpah. X. The kitchen, or rather what served as one, was filled with a warm atmosphere as common chatter drifted through the air, accompanied by the deep scent of roasting meat and the simmering bubble of rice and water boiling. Shinji leaned back slightly on the well-worn cushion, patterned a faint purple below him. Ichigo was in the kitchen once again, to everyone's insistence, after they found his venerable skill with culinary dishes. Rose was beside him, blonde hair bunched behind his head, and the two worked in tandem, throwing whatever spice was in reach into the pan held over an open flame. Kisuke was curled up against a wall where soft curtains of silk colored in sweet pastels hung down and collected on the floor. Tightly clasped in his hands was more than a few scrambled sheets of paper. Occasionally he looked up from the pages, adding to whatever ideal conversation suited his fancy before returning to his research. Love and Kensei were seated at the low table with him, the two chattering amicably about the training from earlier in the day. It had been hard, grueling and long in a way that held true to Ichigo's speech on their first day when he had revealed his Shikai. Even now Shinji's muscles were protesting the rigorous movement, and a slight headache throbbed at his temples, the faint purr of Sakanda both appeasing and calming. Hiyori appeared from the corner of his eye, a flying turbulent force of doom that Shinji narrowly dodged, thanking well-honed instincts as she sailed past, springing from rough-hewn rock to land on her feet. Lisa and Mashiro entered the cave behind her in a far more graceful manner, damp hair curling around their necks. Kisuke had, after a few prompting jostles and threats of telling Yorichi from Ichigo, shown them the hot springs and given them a simple explanation of their healing properties. Mashiro seated herself beside Kensei, practically curled on his lap, bubbled light in her eyes and a joyful smile curled faintly on her lips. Lisa stalked towards the tall kitchen table where Rose and Ichigo were preparing the meals. With an amused flick of her long braids of raven hair, she slid into the chair, pulling a thin novel from the folds of her shiakusho. She cracked it open and began to read, warm candlelight glinting off the red frames of her glasses. Hiyori scowled and stalked over many of her familiar nicknames for Shinji heavy on her lips. With an irritated smile, Shinji in a fond but exasperated manner beckoned the blonde to sit down. With great reluctance and more drama than necessary, she plopped down between Love and Shinji. Aizen looked up from where he was polishing his Zanpakuto, watching the following scene with detached interest. He pushed up his glasses before he returned to running the blunt rock down Kyoka Suijutsu's gleaming sides. "Naichi Berry, what's that on your arm?" Mashiro questioned, her chipper voice rising above the normal chatter, a dull buzz registering barely on the end of one's senses. Ichigo spluttered, his movements grinding to a halt. He stared incredulously at Mashiro for a movement before his gaze was involuntarily drawn to his own arms. The sleeves of his shiakusho that normally tickled the tips of his fingers were rolled back, held together with a few pieces of string so the man could cook without dragging fabric everywhere. Shinji's eyes fixed on Mashiro's point of interest, noting thick charcoal lines nestled in the crook of Ichigo's elbow. Ichigo sighed and with a shrug answered, "It's a tattoo." Shinji could feel Aizen's amusement from across the room at the young lieutenant's uncertain answer. Caramel eyes bubbled intensely, and with another small shrug Ichigo turned to start working on the food once more. Mashiro would not let the matter rest easily. With nimble acrobatic grace, she sprung from Kensei's lap and flounced over to Ichigo, leaning over the counter to better glimpse the work of art imprinted within his skin. With a heavy sigh, Shinji cursed his curious nature and rose from his chair, stalking over to glare at the tattoo on his friend's arm. A faint blush was dusting Ichigo's cheeks at all the attention, and Shinji wondered how the man could resist Yorichi's whims and charms and yet get embarrassed at the slightest of things. The circle was small, perhaps the size of a sake cup. Inside, a crescent moon shone over a lone desert where a black dato reached out from endless mounds of golden sand. Any special meaning, Ichi, or did ya get it when ya were drunk? Ichigo scoffed at Shinji's innocent question. Rolling his eyes, he continued to prepare the meal with casual grace, a pensive expression casting his features in half shadows before he replied, "It's kind of a tribute to my Zanpakuto." Ichigo answered half-heartedly. It was amazing how seriously the man could respond to any normal question but pose one innocent question about his life, and he was spluttering and blushing like a teenage whelp. Mashiro frowned and began poking the orangutan in the arm, a petulant expression on youthful features. Ichigo's eyes flashed up, heavy but calm. He sighed and looked around the room as if seeking help from the audience, now watching the interaction with rapt attention. "The moon is a representation of the name of my blade, the katana is one of the forms Zanjutsu has taken, and the desert is where many turning points have occurred in my life. Finally, a circle to represent the endlessness of our bond." Ichigo turned his head after explaining the tattoo, his gaze fixed above the collective heads fixed on him. A nervous tic showed itself as he reached up and abashedly rubbed the back of his neck. Shinji smiled faintly. It was just like Ichigo to have a tattoo so meaningful. The bond he showed with his Zanpakuto was amazing to witness, a trust and fluidity that came from working together in intimate ways in many years. "Damn inquisitive wizard," Ichigo mumbled under his breath. Shinji barely catching the quick rush of words, he quirked an eyebrow at the title that had slipped from Ichigo's lips. Ichigo looked up slowly, as if just blatantly realizing that they had heard him. He frowned at the playful light in Shinji's eyes. "Now Ichi-kun, what did ya call us? Wizard, eh? What's that mean?" Shinji let out a rush of questions, eyes gleaming as he drew in the attention of the others at the name Ichigo had unknowingly given. Ichigo squawked eyes wide. He began cursing under his breath before a calming moment later he rolled his shoulders and said, "Wizard means mask." The young Shinigami answered uncertainly to the growing amusement of the gathered souls. Kensei looked up from underneath the hood of his hair and commented, "That's quite the cool title, Ichi. Mind if we call ourselves it?" Ichigo let out a groan, running a hand through tangled orange locks even as he nodded and mumbled, "Of course, I just had to bring it up." Laughter rippled through the small crowd of people at the youth's agony, the newly dubbed Vizard watching on with interest. The group fell into new silence, the name running along their minds fitting and perfect. "Dinner is served," Rose announced, interrupting the thoughtful silence as the two chefs began carrying out plates upon plates of food fit for a feast, setting them on the long and low wooden table. Everyone gathered around the table, the warm atmosphere of the cave bubbling over into their hearts as gentle chatter began and the food was dished out. A chorus of approval and delight rang out and the two cooks blushed under the heady praise. Shinji easily agreed that he would forsake Soul Society for food this heavenly. "Aizen, can you please pass the salt?" Ichigo asked, his lilting tone calm and sure in the warmth of the cave's stalactites and stalagmites hanging and peeking up from the ground around them. Aizen quirked a brow, a small frown stealing across his face before a peculiar light danced in his eyes and he looked up, catching Ichigo's soulful chocolate eyes. "You can call me Sosuke Ichigo, I think we know each other well enough for that." Ichigo stopped in his movements of taking the salt from Aizen's hand, eyes wide in surprise, his mouth falling open slightly. Aizen smirked and Shinji couldn't help but join him at the innocent and open expression resting on the Orangette's features. Like a robot slowly coming to life, Ichigo blinked and took the salt, setting it before him. He stared uncomprehendingly for a moment before with a shake a faint smile tilted the corners of his lips. "Sosuke it is then," Ichigo responded simply among the near-silent air of the table. The moment hung for a breath, some movement of the gods before normal chatter resumed as Kensei nagged Mashiro for flicking rice at his face. Shinji settled back once more, watching the scene play out fondly. He wasn't the only one, his eyes always seeming to catch that bright flash of orange were drawn to Ichigo. A strange smile danced across his lips, fond but oh so sad, like his soul was heaving under some great pressure contained only by his sheer force of will. Ichigo's eyes were the ocean, gray and overcast, a swirling mix thrashing with emotions so deep and plentiful that Shinji felt he was drowning under the force of them. Turning his head away, he caught sight of Rose. The blonde was also watching Ichigo, heart heavy in his eyes and a melody dancing from his fingertips. Looking around the table at smiling faces flushed in the warm atmosphere, it was easy for Shinji to see that they were family. Sure, they didn't fit together like any normal family, but that was to be expected when they were Shinigami. The geniuses, the fighters, the peacemakers and many other labels woven together like a perfect tapestry. And of course, Shinji could see that already they had adopted Ichi into their group, taken him under their collective wings. Because as much as the young man had strength near unaccountable and mysteries wrapped into the very fiber of his being, he was young. Maybe old for his time, but to the rest of them they could see the soft tilt of his eyes, those chocolate orbs that hardened with experience of battle, not age. They all saw the heartache and sorrow in those eyes, and already it was rekindling urges and instincts of protection within their souls. Mashiro crept out from the warm folds of their bed where Kensei had been pressed against her body, an arm thrown over her figure, drawing the two together. As much as the serious man denied it, he was a cuddlebug and loved pressing the two together. Shaking errant strands of lime out of her eyes, Mashiro began the treacherous journey through the dark towards the kitchen. Passing through another room, Mashiro was startled as two bright orbs made themselves visible in the darkness. The dull flicker of a candle burned to the stub caught the light of soft orange feathers. Padding over, Mashiro squinted, letting her eyes adjust to the dim lighting. She could make out Ichigo leaning against stone of the cave walls wrapped in silk. His bed was nearby and a blanket was haphazardly thrown over his figure. Caramel orbs looked ahead, unseeing, unblinking, and Mashiro wondered for a moment if he was asleep. Then he let out a soft sigh, eyes blinking slowly as if it took an enormous amount of effort to do such a simple action. Caramel orbs focused on Mashiro, surprise coloring his features even as open warmth trickled slowly into his eyes. "Ichiberry, you should be asleep," Mashiro scolded quietly, aware of the Shinigami sleeping nearby. Ichigo had the decency to look bashful as he apologetically smiled, rubbing a hand at the back of his neck. He whispered, "Couldn't sleep." Mashiro frowned, warmth swelling in her chest. She wished she could help the young Shinigami. Her Zanpakuto was practically asking her to sweep the man into a hug. Shaking away idle fantasies, she smiled bright and open, hoping to clear the darkness that hung over Ichigo like thick storm clouds. A faint smile curled upon the Orangette's lips and reassuringly he said, "I'll try and get some sleep." Mashiro nodded, happy with the simple promise. She sprung up from the low crouch, disoriented for a moment. She blinked before turning to face Ichi once more. His eyes still glowed in the darkness, twin peaks glimmering like crystals. Whispering a faint good night, she left the small alcove, the faint sound of shuffling echoing behind her. As she stopped at the entryway, she turned to see the glowing peaks of light vanish and the steady yet faint glow of the candle disappear. The kitchen seemed larger at night, she thought to herself as Mashiro padded inside, reaching out for familiar objects to steady herself as she made her way to the kitchen. Summoning a tiny orb of Reisu in her hands, she flung it up like a rubber ball, letting it hang in the air and illuminate her surroundings. Nodding pleased that she could see, Mashiro gathered some water into the kettle, letting it rest in her hands as she fed it Reisu. Once steam began to flow from the spout, she took her hands away, searching out stray tea leaves to add to the boiling water. With a triumphant smirk, she added a small bag of tea, jasmine by the scent, into the pot. Letting it set, her eyes traced the room craggy depths, dark and mysterious with the cast of light from the orb above. Pouring the tea into one of the clay cups, Mashiro raised it to her mouth, taking a deep inhale of the rich scent before blowing on the hot liquid and taking a tentative sip. Her mind gently wandered over the past few days, floating on gentle currents as she continued to drink the flowery tea. Her whole life had changed, and yet it was all the same. Kensei was still with her, they were alive, and maybe they were different. Vizard, now part hollow, but life was still turning. She knew once the training was finished that she wouldn't be banished to the human world, her home still remained. The thoughts coiled inside her and brought petite shivers of happiness to her form when she imagined the alternative. They all owed Ichigo. He stood up for them, brought forth the right evidence, and put Central 46 in their place. Now he was training them, and if that wasn't enough to be grateful to the man for, Mashiro didn't know what else he had done or suffered through. She thought of the future, how when she had woken a few days ago it had seemed so stark and barren. Oh, there was still color as long as Kensei was by her side and her blade in hand she could push forward. But that didn't stop choking realizations. That fear had been swept away into acceptance and formed into a family. Mashiro thought the future was looking much brighter. Aizen still tickled her nerves like a feather out of place. Yet his eyes were honest, the gleaming facade of the kind and scholarly lieutenant gone and replaced with this cunning and sly man who, no matter how much he tried to stop it, was starting to hope. She still wanted to tear his head off some days, if just to see that smug smirk gone, but other times she was thankful it had happened. They would never have learned what they did if it wasn't for him. Her gaze was drawn to the Herzanpokta resting beside her, the faint gleam of the blade against hilt catching her eyes and reflecting the bright green of her hair. Tugging the scarf wrapped snugly around her neck tighter in the sudden chill of the cave, Mashiro took another sip of tea and sighed, letting all the weight of the day fall from her shoulders. As much as she was energetic and childish, it was her nature. Every once in a while, she needed to sit down and be still, let the world turn on without her. Light seemed to thrum within her body at all time, wanting to jump out and touch everyone she knew bright and catching entwine them in happiness. But still sometimes it was dim, quiet and comforting in a way that was still so bright, just not blindingly so. Taking a slow sip of her tea, Mashiro smiled, looking around her, feeling the waves of Reisu of her family. Kisuke and Tessai's tampered Reisu quiet but murmuring, Aizen's all cold silk and rusted daggers even though it held warmth. Hiyori and Shinji curled near each other, boundless and playful sardonic seriousness, rose an endless melody even as love rested nearby, quiet rhythm. Lisa sharp and witty but warm and kind, Haki all mellow warmth like the sun in winter, Kensei gruff exterior sweet insides, and Ichigo finally drifting to sleep, a vibrant candle fluttering in the wind. Her own Reisu pulsed in response and she closed her eyes, taking in deep breaths of the silence of night. Her family near her and the calm purr of her blade spirit in the back of her mind. Night wrapped its chill embrace around her eyes for a quiet moment. Flashback. They were holed up in one of the broken remains of a house, familiar white brick streaked gray around them. Together. Ichigo wanted to crow for joy even as his mind praised warnings that the happiness couldn't last. They had been separated, killed, broken over and over again, losing each other only to gain the other for a fragile moment. Kisuke and Mayuri had finally begun their large resurrection scheme, or whatever the two insomniacs were phrasing it as a few weeks ago. Reviving all Shinigami, they could. The crux or problem presented was that a soul could only be revived so many times before their Reisu floated into the ether, their soul departing for happier fields. Yet here they were around him again, his family in all but blood, connected by the hollow portions of their souls and days spent training. A hand waved in front of his eyes and Ichigo looked up, slightly startled to see a familiar Cheshire smirk curled on Shinji's lips. The blonde's eyes were light with amusement and teasingly he questioned, "Falling asleep on us, Ichi?" Ichigo shook his head with a grin even as tired weight pulled at his shoulders. It would only be a few more days and then they would be regulated to the inner sect of Soul Society. For now, they were patrolling the borders, more of a wasteland or no man's land when one looked at the desolation that swept debris-littered fields. A warm hand plopped on his head, tangling the untamable mess of orange gathered around his neck. Looking up with a faint frown, Ichigo was met with Lisa's cool blue eyes, almost gray with amusement. Shaking his head and dislodging her hand, he reached up, swatting at her arm in an attempt to disturb the movements. "Naichi, do we have rations for dinner again tonight? I miss your cooking," Mashiro questioned petulantly, though far more subdued than before the war. Her energetic nature had simmered into something calmer, all lethality curled within her body and those brightly stunning eyes. Ichigo shrugged in answer, and after a prompting moment Kensei said, "You know the fire might attract unwanted attention." He curled an arm around her shoulders, stiffened his movements in attempts at comforting the green-haired wizard. He settled slightly at the acknowledging smile dancing across Mashiro's lips. Love laughed, sharing an amused glance with Rose, who was watching the scene with a lazy smile, fingers lightly dancing over guitar strings strapped to a bare board serving as a guitar. Settling back in his perch against one of the walls, Ichigo let his eyes cast out into the darkness, taking in the broken shells of trees and the muddy earth churned under the tramping of far too many feet. Movement lurked in the foreground, and an uneasy prickle traced Ichigo's spine. Hastily he turned to face the group. Reisu spiked in on the alert in the face of a new enemy. Shinji's hand was on Sakonda's hilt the moment he noticed the tense cast to Ichigo's shoulders. Before the blonde could move, however, a turbulent fury of malicious retribution appeared beside him, a well-aimed kick to the shins, spilling curses from his lips. With a nod, the petite woman was marching out the crumbling archway, eyes heavy on her smaller form as it disappeared from sight. The comforting and jovial atmosphere from before was vanished, drifting into the past like their souls. A scream ripped through the air, female in nature and one full of pain and shock. A flurry of movement, and a moment later Ichigo was sneaking out the back window, Zanjitsu strapped firmly at his side, whispering comforting litanies. They approached from all angles, cautious and silent like predators stalking one's prey. Hiyori was kneeling in the middle of the field, hands clenched defensively to her chest. Before any could move towards her, Shinji was in front of her, worry plaintive on his features even as he reached forward, shifting aside her hands and the folds of her tunic. The bitter taint of blood filled his nose, awakening feral instincts. Before he could acknowledge the movement, he was rushing forward and beside Shinji, crouched in front of Hiyori. At a closer angle Ichigo could see the wound. He let out a small hiss, watching a familiar green glow surround Shinji's hands as they were raised to rest along the heaving rise and fall of Hiyori's chest. "Stop, it's a trap," she yelled at him, voice heavy with pain, for more so than expected for her wound, likely trying to conk him on the head but getting nowhere as the captain of the Fifth was far too focused on the wound in front of him. Horror filled Ichigo's chest at her words, and before his instincts could scream any louder he was on his feet, Zanjitsu in his hands, revealing in the freedom of their shikai. They stalked from the trees, 6 stern ritter leading them and a miasma of the Quincy hybrids following behind them. Some distant part of Ichigo recoiled as he faced their odds. The other wizard were still hidden in the shades of cover, but it wouldn't last. Shiro was beside him before Ichigo could ask the spirit. Knowing his king far too well, he walked towards Hiyori, crouching to whisper a few sparse words to Shinji. The man reluctantly left Hiyori, coming to stand beside Ichigo. The two faced the sea of enemies. His voice bitter and sardonic, still coveting that Cheshire smirk, said, "We're really fucked, Ichi. Least I got to live with ya for a little while." His words were spoken with careful nonchalance, even as his shoulders tensed. Sakonda grasped in knuckles clenched white. Ichigo could only laugh softly in response, eyes challenging the hordes of enemies around them. The moment was held for a sparse second before the thread was cut and they surged forward, an endless sea of white. The other wizard cut a path through the roiling mass of bodies till they reached the center, where waves of black Reisu surged out, cutting the enemy's numbers in half. Others stumbled in confusion, slashing at the air or behind themselves. Together they formed a circle around Hiyori, who slowly but surely stood the Kido enough to allow her to draw her Zanpakuto once more. They were fighting. Endless waves of blood coated Ichigo's skin like a blanket. Zanjitsu settled into the familiar rhythm of slaughter, dodge, cut, slash, and repeat. The motions went on. One moment Shinji was at his back, Cheshire thin smirk on his lips even as darkness haunted his eyes. Then it was Love waving his, incredibly, large Zanpakuto around, sweeping away enemies like one might sweep dust with a broom. He could feel Shiro at the other side of the circle, his bloodlust and rage at the Quincy for daring to try and hurt his family. It thrummed along their bond a likely sentiment, and Ichigo viciously let Zanjitsu rip into the blank gaze of one of the hybrids. He regretted that they ever had the chance of being created. Sewn from whatever spare parts they could get their hands on and infused by the zombie Sternritter or Bach. His instinct snapped at him before he heard it. Lisa's yell cut short, rebounding throughout the battlefield. His head whipped back so quickly he worried about breaking the speed of sound even as his attentive eyes locked onto her hunched-over form. Raven hair tangled around her face and she cradled her side, the bitter trace of crimson dressing her hands. Mashiro was already beside the injured Lieutenant Blade, flicking up to stop a Sternritter. C. D. He can never remember all of them. A red haze descended over his eyes like a veil, and in the back of his mind he could hear Shiro yelling, "Stupid king! Not now, it's too dangerous." But the words fell flat, barely tracing his thoughts as Zanjitsu began to move faster, cutting apart enemies with waves of frightening and cackling Reisu. He made his way to one of the Sternritter. The battle went on, Ichigo barely aware of the wounds that began to litter his body, no matter how much his Iero and blood vein protected him. The constant motions of battle were beginning to wear on them, and already their numbers were falling. It scraped dully at the back of his mind, Reisu coursing through his veins and setting the world on fire. The enemy's numbers were dwindling, but a nagging suspicion suggested this wasn't the end. He was right, no matter how much he wished he wasn't. Kensei, Lisa, Rose, and Hiyori were in the middle of their circle on the ground, bleeding out or far too injured to fight. That's when two new Sternritter appeared with powers far different from their companions, beaten into the dust, or the three that had fled with their tails tucked between their legs like cowardly dogs. The Visionary and the Miracle, two of the more compromising enemies. Ichigo took a deep breath and slowly let the red filter from his mind, the soothing hum of Zanjitsu returning from where Ichigo had shut him out, shut out everything but the battle. Now was not the time for reckless ventures and slaughter. He shared a quick look with Shinji, the de facto captain of their ragtag group. The blonde nodded his ascension. Sharing a quick glance with Mashiro, the two broke off, heading towards the Visionary. They were better equipped to deal with his underhanded tactics. Love sidled over Zanpakuto, dragging behind him. They turned to face the Miracle. Relentlessly they fought against him, every attack thrown at the man failing and only brining forth some new plight to the fields littered with corpses. Shiro, standing guard over the four incapacitated Shinigami, watched on. Pensive golden orbs shone in the glowing twilight. Nothing worked. Already Love had been battered aside into one of the few walls still standing, crumbling to the ground like a rag doll. Puppet soldiers in white had surged forward, sensing weakness, but Shiro had already sported him away to their small sphere of safety. Regarding the man in front of him, Ichigo thought of what Zaraki had told him of his own fight with the man. He didn't have the brute force nor resistance to dying that Zaraki seemed to possess. It came to him slowly, even as Zanjitsu ripped up to cut the man's arm off, sliding against diamond-like skin. Spiriting away from the man for a small breath of space, Ichigo let go of the tight grip of his Quincy powers, blue Reisu whirling around him in great spirals. He had considerate control over his powers, but even now he sometimes struggled, just so as he struggled with that portion of himself when he witnessed all his kin had done. He felt Shinji's presence by his side, a rush of black Shiakusho and Sakonda's purring. "Ya really thinking or releasing that Ichi?" Ichigo only nodded. The man gave him a once-over before he backed off, watching with awe in his eyes. The captain of the 5th had always been amazed to see Ichigo's powers released. It was always a surprise considering the training the young man slipped in between their next meetings, and he had been dead for a few months, so that didn't help. It curled around his form as Zanjitsu's smaller blade was rotated upwards, coming to rest in the center of his eyes. Blood trickled from where the blade was pressed against his skin. Channeling his Reisu, he let it surge outwards, old man Zanjitsu's cloak wrapping around his form before settling around his shoulders. His skin was white fire, burning agony tamed just beneath the surface, pulsing from beneath him. Familiar gauntlets wrapped his hands, and a work of metal glowing bright in pale night's caress surrounded his chest, encasing his legs and coming up to curl around his neck, clasping the flowing cloak in place. A hood was draped over his head, hiding glowing eyes from sight, and shining locks tangling along his shoulders. Heavy wings of Reishi tangled along his back and brushed the ground, the plumage stained a deep ash. The Miracle was dumbstruck, staring at this figure. The image of an angel descended to heaven in fiery wrath, where once the enigma, the troublesome thorn in their side, had stood. Before the large man could blink, Ichigo was in front of him, two different weapons in his hands. In one, a long pole of metal about the length of one's leg, it glimmered strangely hollow and thin, in the other, metal arrows tipped with blue. Before the man could continue looking, said arrow was being smashed into his face. The miracle could hardly protect himself against the sudden change in pace and the vibrant and familiar Reisu striking viciously. It was like that of the miracle's king, that well-known and regal Reisu. Ichigo sprung back, slinging the metal rod in front of his face. It bent, taking the peculiar form of a bow. Ichigo notched his arrow and sent it flying. A whispered, "Getsuga Tensho." It streaked towards the miracle, piercing through the Quincy and obliterating every particle of Reisu it touched, the tinge of red tracing the waves of Reisu far too telling. Before the creature of a man could reassemble himself in any way, Ichigo tipped back his hood. Light shone from him like 1,000 suns, blinding and scorching the earth before him. The metal rod and arrow joined and morphed into a long sword of 15th century make before embedding itself in the center of the miracle's forehead. Bright light pulsed around them. The two locked in that moment. Ichigo's eyes, smoldering pits of light, locked onto the miracles before the man was gone. Burned to ash and then nothing more in the fierce canopy of light that enfolded the two like a dying star. Ichigo stepped back, shedding his Vollständig with a world-weary sigh. He almost collapsed to his knees there on the field if it weren't for Shinji supporting him. Together they hobbled back to the group. Most were sitting up now, but the stench of blood was still poignant. It happened so quickly. Ichigo blinked and they were there. Modified hollows surrounding them, beady eyes gazing at them in hunger. It was a regular Tuesday, except they just kept coming and would not let them rest. Pulling Zanjutsu to his hands, Ichigo stood up, swaying on his feet for a moment before with a breath Reisu was racing through his veins, lighting him on fire. It looked bad and he would need all his power to stop the next wave. Already too many of the Vizard were injured and it would be through hell and high water if they made it through the battle all alive. Ichigo overestimated their chances, he thought bitterly to himself as his breath came out heaving in his lungs, Zanjutsu oh so heavy in his hands. Blood caked him like a second skin, gluing one eye shut from a head wound and sticking his fingers together like claws. On and on they fought, lingering in the dust till the sun peaked the crust of the earth. He wondered why Soul Society hadn't sent reinforcements. They probably wanted to conserve their forces and thought they could handle it. Screams rang up around him, his heart tearing in two even as he kept fighting these hollows, so fast and with mouths that chomped and teared at everything. Lisa was beside him. He could almost taste her exhaustion as she collapsed to the ground, spent blood pouring from multiple injuries. Ichigo was sporting his fair share, blood heaving from his torso even as his healing weakly bubbled in a vague attempt at stopping it. Finally it was done. On trembling hands and knees he crawled towards them, hunched and curled upon the ruins, a ragged group of weary soldiers. Hiyori looked from her position beside Shinji, defensive of him. Her eyes scanned him, bright and thankful for the moment. His heart seemed to collapse in his chest as he spotted Mashiro crying over Kensei, his broken form mangled to his sight, eyes vacant, looking at the swift blue overtaking the sky. Love and Rose rested side by side, still as the stone hands clasped tightly together. The air mourned their passing with haunting notes, staccato and piano they twined his heartstrings. Lisa coughed weakly, blood streaming from her lips, her chest a patchwork of skin and bone. Heaving a groan, Ichigo crawled towards her, a familiar green glow shuddering from his palms. Healing her enough that she wasn't critical, Ichigo fell back, the gravity of his wounds only seeming to come to attention now to Lisa's sharp cry. Darkness curled his vision, life struggling to escape his lips, and for a moment he desperately wanted to embrace it. Death hadn't taken him yet, and they were 5 or 6 years into the war. He had come damn close too many times, but he had always pulled through. Just as he would now, because he couldn't leave them all alone, or at least the rest of them alone. Sometimes it was so tempting, the thought of leaving it all behind to finally find peace. Lisa's cries became stark and he opened his eyes as arms wrapped firmly around his torso, pain springing up his spine. He wondered if he had cracked it again. That wasn't a pleasant few months under Anohana's watchful gaze. Looking up through tear-filled eyes, Ichigo caught sight of Uriu's sorrowful eyes, familiar Reisu both comforting and disparaging wrapped around him. Ichigo was confused, and it must have shown as the man leaned down to rest his head against Ichigo's. Whispered, "I'm sorry," heavy on his lips. Then he was walking away, Ichigo in his arms, too weak, almost faint to struggle against him, just as the others were bound to the ground, their injuries too devastating. The smell of burning flesh began to fill the air, and with dawning horror Ichigo realized what was happening. The Quincy left none of their dead behind. The other Stern Ritter, those they could salvage, Ichigo wished them good luck with the miracle, were likely already gone. Otherwise the cannon fodder were worthless, and they'd rather not have them fall into the hands of the Shinigami. "Oh, old man, please." Ichigo's voice was torn, but the small whisper carried, he knew what would happen to his family if the flames reached them. Already Shiro was a quiet thrum at the back of his mind, far too exhausted to even speak or warn Ichigo of Uriu's approaching presence. Feeling a burning tug in his chest, then fire-cracking pain, Uriu swept his eyes down as Ichigo let out a pain-filled gasp. Old Man drifted across the fields. He could feel the press of flames against his spirit, but it was too much. He was losing focus. The darkness was approaching again. He could see worry in those deep blue eyes that always made Orion blush. There was yelling. He was sure the screams of the burning. He felt their familiar Reisu die scatter in the wind, never to be traced again. A few escaped, he thought. Was his name being yelled? I'm sorry. Was that Uriu's calm voice or Zanjitsu's baritone that spoke those words? Ichigo succumbed to the darkness, eyes wet and burning just as his heart teared itself to shreds. It began again. Accusing eyes staring at him, burned flesh clawing at his arms, legs, everything. There was no escape. Their voices came out broken, rasping. They yelled at him, chanting his name over and over again. He was choking. Crimson spilling from his mouth in endless waterfall as their blades pierced his stomach, turning it inside out. With friendly smiles on their faces, their voices were like nails on a chalkboard, an endless mantra: your fault. All your fault. Why did ya fail us, Ichi? Save us. Failure. Useless. What can you ever protect? Your fault. Ichigo wanted to claw his own eyes out. It felt like his head was boiling, the lingering pain flaring up again, all-consuming, conquering, tearing into his flesh, soul, and heart. When would it stop? Ichigo wanted it to end, but there was only darkness and their eyes clawing and tearing. Skin falling off their bones, the sickly smell of charred flesh rising to his nose. He felt sick. Ichigo wanted to heave. It began again, their deaths, each and every individual one playing over in his mind. Mashiro wailing over Kensei. Kensei hollow-fying as both lieutenants were struck down. Shinji curling in on himself beside Aizen Hiri, all too far and too close at once. Rose, a dancing corpse. Love clawing at his arms, throes of death chasing his corpse. Lisa screaming endless as pain he couldn't see flashed before her eyes. Haki frozen in place, a still statue, cold as the ash surrounding him. Over and over, 1,000 different ways, and each one his fault. An endless roller coaster that he couldn't escape. There was no way out. Ichigo heard screaming. He wondered if it was the damned or his own insanity finally showing. Their blood was on his hands, his heart. Why wouldn't it stop? Ichigo tilted his head, no tears falling, only blood spilling from his lips. Their laughing smiles fading into bitter chills, the haunting dissonance of their death cradling his mind, rocking it harshly. X. Chapter 20, Welv. X. Mashiro crept along the cave system, silent as a ghost, the dim light of the sphere of Reisu hovering beside her. Night's slumber hung like a blanket around her, and the weight of her own lack of sleep weighed on her eyes. A twist in Reisu had her breath catching for a short moment, the flicker of light on the wall eerie as the sphere shuddered at her shock. As if a cord was tied to her chest, she felt the incessant urge to follow that Reisu. The tangled mix of emotions, earnest and breathtaking, left her cautious but certain of her decision. Tracing her way back towards the mouth of the cave, she entered one of the rooms where the others were sleeping. Fractures of illumination cracked and splintered on the cave walls like hidden fey lights. The room seemed to glow from within the stone. A piercing whine reached her ears and the spell was broken. Mashiro stilled like a statue, head cocked attentive even as a concerned frown twisted her lips. Sound rumbled in the silence and she was striding forward, her heart instructing her feet. She came to the same spot she had stood maybe 3 hours ago, looking down on Ichigo. He was curled upon his bedroll, the blankets a mess of tangled linen around his legs, his bare chest glimmered in the pale lighting, his features were twisted in agony, sharp orange locks matted to his face and casting him in sickly hues of shadow. Ichigo turned suddenly restless, a hand grasping at the blankets fitfully. His voice pleading and indistinct trickled from his lips, a cadence of Reisu following the words. Mashiro debated, wandering forward and attempting to wake the young man for a tense few moments before she surged forward, ever silent in the quiet of the caverns. She reached a hand out to touch Ichigo's shoulder and was met with a potent shock of Reisu. It didn't hurt, yet she was amazed at the pressure behind the muffled shield and the immense weaving that formed the shape clinging to Ichigo. Mashiro stared, pondering her options. She had no idea how to reach Ichigo from behind his self-imposed walls, and the only light in the darkness of the cave seemed to be the threads of Reisu clinging to the walls like spider webs. She didn't know how to help him. They were family, but they were all still strangers. Her mind swiveled to Lisa, the lieutenant of the 8th, all cold exterior but kind demeanor. Decision made, she sprung from her crouch and stalked out of the room, following the bobbing sphere of light as macabre shadows danced like those of the dead in front of the doors. Lisa was curled against the wall, a novel tucked against her chest and her glasses perched on her nose askew. She had fallen asleep reading again, it seemed. Shaking away idle thoughts, Mashiro rushed forward and began shaking the stoic lieutenant. Within a few moments, Lisa was sitting up. The full force of her irritated glare directed Mashiro's way under the heavy pressure of Reisu. "It's Ichigo, he's having a nightmare and I can't reach him." Lisa's harsh expression disappeared in an instant, replaced with concern and a sad tilt to her eyes. She tossed aside heavy sheets, uncaring of the little clothing covering her body. She marched through the hallways, raven hair loose and untamed flying behind her, and Mashiro timidly followed in her powerful wake. Lisa made a sharp left before Mashiro could protest that she had entered the wrong room. The woman was padding over silently to where a crown of blonde peeked above a mound of green blankets. She leaned down beside Kisuke and whispered in his ear loud enough for Mashiro to hear, "Wake up, your Yuiki's coming." The man sprang to life like a well-oiled machine, eyes alert and troubled, hands flailing this way and that. Once he noted the two women in front of him. A scowl settled on his face and he arched an eyebrow, questioning them for waking him on their midnight gallivant. This time it was Lisa who spoke. "Ichigo is having a nightmare. We thought we might recruit you for assistance." Kisuke nodded, the frown deeper now, a kind light replacing the irritation that brimmed in metal gray eyes. He stood up, pulling Benihime to his side. He nodded and they moved on, swift shadows of the night. Mashiro hung back as the two rushed forward, following them at a more sedate pace. She had time to watch Kisuke reach over to touch Ichigo, only to receive the sharp shock of the barrier. Kido should have known he would put up something like this. The scientist muddled under his breath, eyes serious and sad as they stared at Ichigo, tossing and turning, sorrow deepening his brow and painting his features. Lisa stared for a moment, contemplative, before she said, "Shunsui mentioned something like this, but I've never seen it anything close to this bad. I've caught Ichigo sleeping before, but..." Lisa trailed off, uncertain, her voice seeming as loud as rocks tumbling through canyons in the air heavy with Reisu. Kisuke leaned forward, reaching out to touch the barrier once more. He let his palm rest against it, gently applying force. He pushed and the air trembled before a barrier, warm orange like flickering flames, shimmered into existence. Then Kisuke was pushed back. He stared at the barrier for a long moment before turning to Lisa, that manic light in his eye signifying he had an idea. She let out a long-suffering sigh before nodding for the man to continue. Kisuke smiled, but it was a facade, bitter and broken in the prevalent sorrow of their friend. His voice was the soft rasp of steel in the echoing silence. "You should try, Lisa-chan. He knows you better, and so his Reisu may not reject you. Whatever this barrier is for, it mainly protects us and protects him. You know him the best out of the rest of us. I'm sure that's why Mashiro went to you first and not Shinji or myself." Lisa nodded with a spine of determined steel. She crouched and rested her palm against the barrier. It shuddered for a moment, and Lisa thought about applying more force and pressure before she remembered Ichigo. The young Shinigami wasn't one for violence as much as he was experienced with it. Force would only cause his Reisu to lash out. The lieutenant took a deep breath, letting her Reisu still like that of a compound, only her presence resting above the well of her Reisu. The barrier shuddered before like a curtain. It folded on itself, disappearing from sight, still there, only pushed aside. With the disappearance of the barrier came waves of Reisu like monsoon season. They swam around the three Shinigami, engulfing them and choking the breath from their lungs. It was heavy, and suddenly they were wading through water or standing on top of a mountain, breathing in thin air. The sounds that followed teared their hearts apart. "My fault, all my fault. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Lisa, no, don't, please don't. Why? Why am I so weak? Why can't I be strong enough to save you? God damn it. No, it's my fault. Shinji, stop, don't do this. Why can't I save you?" On and on the words spilled from his lips, interrupted every so often by a pitiful moan or whimper. What calm the three Shinigami possessed dissolved at those heartbreaking words. Ichigo's voice cracked with emotion, raw in a way he usually tampered and tamed within his eyes. They were frozen where they stood still like statues, listening as those words dragged on. Finally Kisuke mustered the will to turn to Lisa, gesturing with his hand that one of them might wake Ichigo from his torment. The raven-haired lieutenant shook her head for a moment before her voice came out silent and soft. She said, "It's not that easy. Ichigo has instincts ingrained in his body and soul. I've seen them in action. A poor unsuspecting member of the squad reached over to poke Ichigo and suddenly they were on the ground, spine aching with sudden impact. War has shaped the figure in front of us in more ways than one, but I will try. She crouched and slowly, like the opening of the buds of flower in the coming morning, rested her hand on Ichigo's shoulder. He shuddered and tossed, dislodging her arm. His hand reached out towards Zanjitsu before falling short. She tried again, this time firm in her movements. She called his name softly, trying to pull him back from Morpheus' realm, the tangle of dreams hovering over his eyes. Ichigo's back arched, rising clear of his bed, mouth open as if feeling some deep pain before he collapsed, eyes fluttering open slowly. Tired brown eyes were revealed, hazed with confusion and misted with sorrow. Lisa pulled him into a tight hug, arms wrapping around his lithe form and cocooning him in her warmth and love. Ichigo blinked, slowly coming to life. He stared at Lisa, not realizing she was there in front of him, or in disbelief and wonder at her presence. The Orangette pulled back a hand, dragging it up to rest against her cheek, feeling her presence and the deep Reisu like satin sheets. Ichigo faltered, hand falling to rest at his side. He stared at the three Shinigami around him in partial confusion, so tender and young looking. It was like a cloak obscuring this from their eyes had been stripped away by Ichigo's sudden waking. Two wide eyes, the youth of his soul, clear in amber orbs, swimming and mingling with 1,000 emotions, but overwhelmingly sorrow. Mashiro was there beside Ichigo from one moment to the next, her warm hand, her presence resting on his shoulder as the other hand came up to idly tangle with orange locks. Kisuke stayed where he was, sat in front of Ichigo, reassurance heavy in his soul. He asked, solemn and still in the quivering night, "Ichigo, do you always have such nightmares?" The young Shinigami nodded of his own accord, responding near instantly where under daylight he would have pandered for time, letting the silence reverberate like the ticking of a time-worn clock. Something faltered in Kisuke's chest at that answer, the blatant acknowledgement of why Ichigo was always so weary, the heavy lines of purple under his eyes seeming all the more stark. The two women were suddenly engulfing the young man's Reisu, clinging to his form, warm and soothing, just as their arms gripped his lithe form, sharing what comfort and solace they could with Ichigo. It was Lisa that next pierced the silence, assuring in a way that the others couldn't quite be yet. She was familiar with Ichigo and shared a bond of friendship with him. "You are not at fault for whatever happened, Ichigo. We're still here and we're not going anytime soon." Those eyes brightened impeccably, the message seeming to reach Ichigo through whatever haze his mind swam through, and he nodded slowly. Then the mask was slowly resurrected from its hiding place. His features became like carved stone. Embarrassment or shame crowned his cheeks in a faint blush, and he turned his head away, those amber eyes darkening once more. Kisuke wanted to understand why Ichigo didn't believe them, rejected soulfully honest words. He saw it in the tight fist and trembling chest. Ichigo was taut like a bowstring in their arms where once he was settled. The girls pulled back sad but understanding smiles on their faces. Kisuke wished for the light to appear, cleanse the sorrow that hung heavy on the air, but there was only the nautical bob of Mashiro's Reisu orb. "Thank you." It was the only words he'd spoken in the time of his waking, and Kisuke could hear the honesty with a nod to Mashiro, lime hair radiant as her eyes in the cavern. He heaved himself to his feet, ignoring the ache of an old man. Mashiro followed, leaving the two lieutenants together for a moment. Lisa was quick to follow. After placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder and whispering something in his ear, she appeared beside them, shivering in the drafts of the cave. Kisuke tucked down the nostalgia of creeping through these hidden paths with Yoryuki and Tessai cloaks thrown over their shoulders and the cool earth and rock below freezing and tactile against bare feet. They were silent even as promise hung on the air, encompassing all three of them. With goodnight partings on their breath, they went their separate ways, even as Ichigo's haunting words and the sight of his agony curled upon his features flashed in their mind's eye. It occurred to Kisuke that very few saw this side of the young man, and he had to wonder how Ichigo had struggled and survived for so long. He thought of those caramel orbs blazing with determination and found his answer lingering there in his soul. Kisuke regarded the man in front of him with hooded eyes, idly letting his gaze drop to the low table they were seated at, studying the rich grain of the amber wood. The subtle smell of sake pervaded the air. Silence hung like a blanket, though it was unoppressive, the two intelligent Shinigami content to sit in the presence of the other and absorb the world around them. Ever thoughtful minds traveling some hidden path. The clear chime of dusk settled over the world, and Kisuke rolled his shoulders, looking up and across the table at Aizen. The man had changed in many ways since Kisuke had first met the sly lieutenant. Then Benihime had whispered warning in his ears and seeded caution in his heart. Now she purred content that the great force before them was somewhat subdued. It's such an indicating phrase. Aizen's comment drifted on the silence. Kisuk quirked a brow waiting for the man to continue and was patiently rewarded a few moments later. Ichigo's release phrase, "tear the heavens asunder," it implies many things about his character. Kisuk could see now what the man was talking about. Ichigo's Shikai had been stunning, 2 blades of great caliber and a manner of fighting so raw and totally Ichigo that Kisuk had a hard time placing anything familiar. It seems young Ichi is destined to continue his path of havoc through Soul Society. Aizen scoffed at Kisuk's casual turn of phrase, eyes soft in a way they became concerning only a few things, one of them mainly being Ichigo. The young Shinigami had grown on them both more so than some would like to admit. He knew Aizen likened it to some fungi silently creeping in before settling deep roots in the earth of their hearts. Curling his head back, Kisuk looked up at the spires rising around them, the artificial blue sky daunting and peaceful. He will rewrite Soul Society or heaven itself. That is what he is, a man who stands in the face of heaven. I think that in this case to tear asunder does not mean reaping destruction, merely a change from the current situation. Aizen's gaze was sharp, accepting the vague phrase and all it represented. Ichigo had already wrought change upon their tamed pastures. He had convinced a man so old and set in his ways to change and accept the unique situation of the wizard. What do you think he's hiding? Aizen queried softly, head tilted to the side, gaze different, contemplating some other frame of thought. Kisuk's own thoughts took a turn towards the many secrets that surrounded the Orangette. A large file of questions he had collected rested somewhere in the tangled clutter of his office, but the likelihood of him finding it was closer to the sudden reveal of Ichigo's Bankai. The young man was altogether strange. Showing a fake Shikai at the academy, his sudden arrival in Soul Society, the mysterious manipulation of his Reisu. The list could go on, likely enough questions to wrap around the whole of the training area. I don't know, it seems every time we draw close to the answer of even one mystery it is disproven and 4 more pop up. Aizen nodded and reached out, taking a sip of the sweet sake. He set it down, leaning back on the low futon. His eyes drifted to Kyoka Suijutsu's blade, the hilt an ever-splendid reminder of trickling water and morning light caressing dew. I think he is certainly more than he seems. Have you heard what Captain Kairo has said? In his words, Ichigo was in a war none of us have seen. The answer seems to hold more truth than anything else to be devised. The question remains, what war? I've seen flashes, but I could hardly identify the enemy from the ally. Kisuk listened with half intent to the idle musings of Aizen, the man twirling a wayward curl of hair around his fingertips as he stared at the horizon. Captain Kairo was a wise man, even if he hid it behind the persona of a drunkard, and he was all too close to the matter at hand. Some Shinigami had seen the war with the Quincy, but most souls were far too young. That doesn't mean Shinigami hadn't seen blood. Just so the haunted look that saturated any veteran's eyes and wallowed misery in their hearts was heavy upon Ichigo's brow. It was a war they could not place, because Ichigo didn't tell them, and until he revealed the information it would likely remain hidden. He had 2 sisters, Karin and Yuzo. Did you know? Kisuk shook his head, surprised at the sudden revelation, but the thought of Ichigo as a brother was wholly unshocking. The young man sometimes carried a maternal touch, putting to rest with ease rampant thoughts of young Shinigami, or the gentle touch of a healer born of experience. The way Aizen intoned his words left far more unsaid, and Kisuk caught the man's cavernous meaning. Those sisters were gone, released from this world, and Ichigo, the soul he was, had taken their deaths upon his already weighed down existence, likely shouldering the guilt on top of that. They shared a quick look, easily full of understanding regarding their young friend, already considered quite intelligent in their eyes. The 2 scientists felt protective over the young Shinigami, and Kisuk was quite unfamiliar with the sensation. He was sure Aizen was quite lost as himself. For they had no idea how to aid Ichigo. He shouldered all questions about his past to the side, and even then, pain radiated from his core like the burning suns of summer. He is the youngest of us all? Aizen arched an eyebrow at Kisuk's sudden statement. Kisuk ran a hand through his mess of tangled locks sticking slightly to his neck, with the faint heat pulsing along the air. He continued, I managed to analyze some of his soul when we were working in the laboratory one day. Right now, he's barely close to 100. Aizen blinked in shock, his mouth hinging open slightly before he regained himself. He shook his head in partial amusement, eyes far too dark before his deep voice lilted, of fucking course. You know, sometimes I worry about the protectiveness and concern for the orange-haired kid, but then I see those puppy dog eyes or the heartbreak, and I know they're justified. No one that young, nor especially Ichigo, should have to deal with so much pain. Kisuk listened in slight shock to Aizen's mini-rant. The man finished by downing the cup of sake in front of him, topping it up immediately after. The man smiled somewhat sheepishly, and Kisuk let an indignant smile filter onto his features, darkness echoing his own thoughts on the matter. I understand what you mean. Benihime sings for the blood of an enemy we can't see, and as much as we want to help the young man, we're left floundering in the dark. I fear the day he cracks and the pressure becomes too much. Ichi is strong, and it's the strongest people who break the hardest, and Kami, will I be there when he falls? Aizen nodded his head in promise, the two sharing another look, agreement heavy in their eyes. They settled into the silence, fishing through the sake, trying to temporarily drown the feelings that weighed heavily on their minds and hearts. What are your thoughts on the wizard? Aizen questioned, deciding to continue the conversation in the heavy atmosphere and tense silence that had pervaded after Aizen's unfinished thoughts. Kisuk nodded, closing his eyes and letting his thoughts collect before he spoke. I think it is lucky Ichigo was with us. Without him we would have been going in blind, unknowing of how or why we needed to tame their Zanpakuto. There would have been a positively large amount of stumbling, and I doubt if Ichigo wasn't here then you likely would be far away. Still, it is fascinating to see the changes wrought to the construction and soul energy of a person. Aizen nodded, pensive gaze drifting to the horizon. He frowned for a moment before the expression cleared and he said, have you seen the Reisu samples? Kisuk thought to their small station set into the wall of one of the caves, a rough workstation of cluttered papers and experiments, except for one small corner. That was where Aizen had put his foot down and forbid Kisuk from encroaching on the only clean space of their area. In working together to discover treatments for the wizard and the ever-growing complexity of the Hogyaka, they had found a common ally in their love of science. Yes, it's quite interesting, the complexities of the DNA sample. The Hollow Reisu had entwined itself within the Shinigami Reisu, creating a whole new genetic pattern. Ichigo mentioned briefly that something like this occurs on the other end of the spectrum for hollows. It would be interesting to see how the Reisu has affected the complicated makeup of a hollow. Aizen nodded, eyes flickering with interest at the prospect of extensive research and the intended results. Before their conversation could continue, subtle Reisu swept across their senses, tempered in the way that was uniquely Ichigo. The orangutan appeared at the edge of their perspective. He stalked through the forest of rocky spires, head in the clouds. Abruptly he stopped, looked around in confusion for a moment before ember eyes alighted on the two-seated Shinigami. He tilted his head as if asking entrance, and Kisuk made a small gesture with his hands, beckoning the orangutan over. The young man remained rooted to the earth for a moment before, with a sigh that shook his shoulders, he was walking over to them. Ichigo settled opposite the two scientists, the light catching his hair and setting it on fire. Aizen fetched another cup from some hidden place. Someone likely Shinji had taken to establishing irregular hiding spots for sake cups like some great hide and seek, and poured a liberal amount before sliding the porcelain glass over to Ichigo. He nodded his thanks, tipping the glass back like a shot with a slight grimace. Kisuk raised an eyebrow and with a playful demeanor said, "Bad day, Ichi." The orangutan shook his head, gaze vacant and focusing on the broad plains before he shrugged and said, "Not bad overall, just long." They nodded in sympathy, having watched Ichigo instruct the wizard like a drill sergeant with all the fiery passion of the Suteiko channeled through his glare. Ichigo rolled his shoulders, eyes becoming distant as they stared over the land. A bright spark seemed to catch in his eyes, and for a few moments more his hands began to wave in the air, plotting some unviable course. "I've been thinking." Aizen scoffed at the quiet words, mumbling under his breath, "Always a dangerous pastime." To Kisuk's amusement and Ichigo's ire, the curly-haired lieutenant received the full force of Ichigo's glare before the young man's shoulders slumped. Kisuk's eyes softened and he motioned for Ichigo to continue. He was shot a slightly grateful look before Ichigo said, "The Hogyaku is not only capable of dissolving the boundaries between Shinigami and Hollow. It possesses the unique and altogether dangerous ability to grant one's heart's desires." The two Shinigami stared at Ichigo, wondering where this sudden revelation had come from. Ichigo looked up, eyes distant and calculating, assessing their reactions before he continued, "I knew of a weapon like this one, and a man who possessed it wishing to conquer all. But when I crossed blades with him I found only loneliness, and as such I became the one who defeated him. Just so the Hogyaku possesses that ability, and as such is far more dangerous than originally thought, for one only need wish from the depths of their heart for the fall of Soul Society and it would be upon us." The air was suddenly serious with the understanding of Ichigo's words, and they shared painted stares before Kisuk spoke up, I can understand wanting to bring this to our attention, but I understand there is more you wish to elaborate on. Ichigo nodded and turned his head to look at the horizon where the sky dipped and swelled with colors. His voice was thoughtful and calm. It can also be used for good. In the case of our own Shinigami, Yukatake Teiko's sickness will not find a cure within our reaches no matter how much the two of you research, but if Shu Captain Kairo were to possess the stone and wish for the health of his friend, it could be plausible for his recovery. Aizen and Kisuk stared at the young man for a contemplative moment before a smile cracked Aizen's lips and a peaked frown settled on Kisuk's lips. He voiced his own thoughts. The dangers are still vast, and even though we are souls, we remain human. You've seen what's happened recently to the souls. Radiation poisoning that drifts into the afterlife. A crime so severe and horrendous that it damages the cycle of life and death. Ichigo only nodded, eyes morose and heavy with the weight of his understanding, and it was those amber eyes that let Kisuk's words fall short, breath-catching. Aizen frowned a bit, puzzled as he tried to recall what Kisuk spoke of. Ichigo, seeing his confusion, said, "Recently we noticed a trend of increasing souls within the outer districts of Rungokai. Some of the souls are soldiers of a war and others are the victims, numerous chemical attacks and radiation. As much as Soul Society's 12th division is advanced, the rest of Soul Society is severely lacking." Ichigo spoke with the cold clinical detachedness of one remarking on the weather. Light dawned in Aizen's eyes and he quieted, thoughts turning behind his eyes like well-oiled machinery. Kisuk looked up suddenly, golden hair whipping around his head as he caught Ichigo's eyes with his own cool metal gray orbs. "You want to keep it a secret, hide it from the common knowledge, just as much as your true Zanpakuto." Ichigo nodded slowly and surely, and when next he spoke they were shocked by his words. Soul Society needs to see change. It's already beginning, the chain reaction that whips and coils, breaking all too strong and reforging those into what needs to be. We humans are far too foolish takers of the earth, not understanding what it truly means to give. The premise of the taker story is, the world belongs to man. The premise of the leaver story is, man belongs to the world. Ichigo finished the quote softly to the suddenly very bright eyes of his audience as they struggled through the fracture of his words. He smiled then. Faint and barely there, but more real than the reassuring smiles cast their way when they questioned him on the haunting sadness. A stunning novel, Ishmael, not yet published. I'll lend you a copy when it's out. Maybe you can see more than the threads of society blindfolding us. Ichigo winked and descended into silence, head tipping back to stare at the luminous skies above. Kisuk and Aizen stared at the orange head, shock written on their features at the information, the clue, the tease, or whatever Ichigo made that left those lips. As always, Ichigo had left them so little, and they felt as if all the clues were there. They need only find the correct way to piece the puzzle together. Kisuk shared a slightly apologetic expression with Aizen before he was regarding the collection of papers scattered on the low-end table, half-finished diagrams teasing them. Aizen nodded, pleased with the idea of returning to work rather than trying to wrap his mind around an endless circle. Ichigo sighed contently, leaning against the rocks beside him. He closed his eyes, chest rising and falling with gentle breaths. Ichigo looked different with his eyes closed, altogether a different man, as if for the world's bafflement he was a teenager soaking in the sun. Aizen, do you think there's a possibility? Kisuk voiced the question silently, wishing to leave Ichigo undisturbed, knowing the young man hasn't slept a wink since they found him in the throes of a nightmare a few days ago. Aizen nodded, perceptive as always, and they would compare notes, theorize if the topic of their discussion was not a few feet away. It would explain many things: the power, knowledge, sorrow every time he walks down the street. Ichigo mumbled under his breath at Aizen's soft words, head turning to the side before stilling. Kisuk nodded, and the whisper of wind-shuffled paper seemed to echo the truth of their guess. It sent shivers down Kisuk's spine as he stared at Ichigo, wondering if it's all true. Rose wondered when he signed up for this hell. Then he reasoned, probably the first moment he entered the Goti 13, as if his fate was written in the strings of time, a sheet of music, all the notes plotted out. Some scribbled and erased hastily, others thick and clear. He believed that meeting Ichigo was one of those notes, clear and precise, starting piano soft before a crescendo to a forte loud and strong. He thought this as he pushed up from where he was sprawled in the dirt, curly blonde locks bunched at the back of his neck, and love breathed heavily beside him. Rose honestly wondered how a kid, because Ichigo is a kid, could defeat them so thoroughly without his mask on. But then they were on their feet, Kinshara teasing him in that sweet melodious voice that always stirred a certain bloodlust. Love was in front of him extending a hand and Rose gratefully took it, letting himself be pulled up. The two locked eyes for a moment before turning to face the sudden bane of their existence. Hiyori was hammering away at Ichigo, her splintered blade whirring through the air as she yelled obscenities at the orangutan, calmly deflecting her attack. The other Vizard watched on in partial amusement, partial hesitation, knowing that inevitably they would have to rejoin the battle. Rose flicked his bangs to the side, ignoring Love's amused huff. He hefted his shikai and gathered his Reisu, the now familiar yet still foreign mask forming over features. He quite liked the look and shape of it. The feel of Reisu condensed over one's eyes sparked like the grand finale of a piece and was altogether an intimate experience. Beside him Love mirrored the movement, and with a slight nod the partners charged into battle. Ichigo looked up from where he was flicking aside Hiyori's sudden strike. With cautious ease he punted the petite lieutenant away, to her irritable screaming. That was when they struck. The others surged forward, the air acidic with hollow Reisu, even as it was chased away by gales of their power raging and coalescing within them as they sought to apply the techniques Ichigo had drilled into their supposedly thick skulls. Springing back from where Zanjitsu's smaller blade darted out to catch a wisp of his robes, Rose raised his hand, channeling his Reisu, focusing on Kinshira's presence within him. Accessing the deep reservoirs of hollow Reisu that now saturated his being. As the Zero formed in his palm, he thought of the day where Ichigo had first shown them everything, the techniques they could master, and the stunning blade he wielded. Rose's thoughts drifted of their own accord to the tremulous feelings that Ichigo's blades had broadcasted when they clashed, euphoria and sorrow prevalent in a tremulous mix of other unamiable emotions. Letting a breath out and the charging hum of his spirit, Rose let the Zero fly forward. Love, well attuned to Rose's fighting, swerved to the side as the crackling ray of red and black energy surged towards Ichigo. A pure ebony blade flicked up and caught the brunt of the Zero, the Reisu pushing out on either side, fanning behind Ichigo. As the attack dispersed and the air was left heavy with the electric charge of Reisu, Ichigo flashed Rose a proud smile before Ichigo flicked up one of his blades to block Shinji's Zanpakuto, even as his other arm caught Mashiro in one of her supercharged Mashiro kicks. Love nodded and the two flew forward, bloodlust heavy in their veins. Kinshara clashed against Zanjitsu with the bright flash of sparks and the echoing ring of metal against metal. Springing back, Rose swung his blade up once more, silently letting the blade switch back to Shikai, the golden rope catching the light and flashing like a snake on its path towards Ichigo. The orangutan smirked, a sudden ebony wave of Reisu surging in their direction, and Rose wanted to curse his existence as he hastily brought up his blade to defend himself. He hurtled towards the rocky earth below with a pained groan, crashing into rough terrain. He felt every rock below him. Sometimes he cursed that day in the bar where he had looked at the young man with vibrant hair and seen so much more than an academy student. Pushing up from the small crater, Rose heard a loud crash as Lisa's prone form collided with the ground nearby. Rolling his shoulders, Rose heaved a dramatic sigh and hefted Kinshara once more, flying into battle. Ichigo looked up at his approach, eyes bright in a way they had never seen. As the days had progressed and their skill increased, that light had grown brighter like a beacon or the headlight of the sun charged with purpose and entertainment. They crashed heavily, the weight of Ichigo's blade biting to his shoulders. He warred against the young man. Pushing back, he darted around, feeling Shinji nearby. The golden whip of his Zanpakuto snapped out in an attempt to ensnare one of Ichigo's limbs. That was a mistake, as electricity rippled down the golden rope, sending shocks throughout his system. Folding to the ground, Rose took in a few deep breaths, batting away the pain and the taunting calls of Kinshara. It had been hell the first few days. Their bond that had once hummed like the cities of music had fallen silent, so cold and near broken. Then they had fought, for dominance, for freedom, for passion, for music. He vaguely recalled sensations of the outside world as inside the orchestra of his inner world notes were exchanged. A grand forte beginning to crescendo to far more subtle tones as the melody of blades ringing grew quiet. Their bond had been forged anew, dragged through darkness and taken into the grey where the light did not blind. There was another part of him now, however reluctant they both were to acknowledge it sometimes. Instinct would snap and Rose had to face the darkness in his soul, but better a face and form than the endless whispers that haunt the night. They all realized why they were united like this, working as a team with ease born not of hundreds of years together but the few weeks that had stuck them together like amber and molasses. He was the center of it, that glowing luminescent moon channeling the light of those around him and reflecting upon others so stark and bright one might think he was the sun, and with those orange locks they probably weren't too far off. As the sounds of battle drew near once more, Rose shook off idle musings, a quiet smile curling his lips and a faint melody dancing in his head, light and airy. Ichigo had promised to share some music he was fond of, but the kid had yet to uphold a promise about later dates, accompanied by that cocky smile. Rising from the dust once more, Rose wanted to laugh at how easy it was to shake off the pain and head the call of battle. Drums pounding loud and stiff, the string instruments lonely and morose heralding those fallen, the brass instruments calling out the joyful beat of victory. As always, the dancers swept across the field, intricate movements flowing from one piece to the next. They sprawled out on the rocky surface, panting in the luminescent sun above, sweat beading their brows, and bruises littering their skin. Ichigo felt no sympathy. The shallow cut above his brow, one of the few markers of the past battle, stung slightly. He felt that flutter again, the one that reminded him of Kisuke when he learned a new technique, or his father's eyes when Ichigo rose from the rubble. Ichigo dully acknowledged it as pride to Zanjutsu's pleased purr in the back of his mind, the deep hum calming his senses. His eyelids fluttered closed, blocking out the cool sky above and releasing some of the tension that bubbled and frothed beneath his skin. It was hard being surrounded by the one you considered family day and night, knowing you had caused their deaths. Seeing them die over and over again with no respite, only the heat of battle and the quiet moments of company. A growl echoed from his inner world, and Ichigo could feel Shiro's anger even as Zanjutsu Asen admonished him for the wayward thoughts, chastising Ichigo in that deep baritone. "Ichigo, it was not your fault." Ichigo tried to acknowledge them, the words were true. A hidden part of his soul told him so, even as his war-carved heart protested. He wanted to believe them, that night cloaked in shadows where the flames of his mind had struck ruthlessly. But sometimes it was hard to acknowledge the light, think for a moment that he could be forgiven, that it wasn't his fault. Other times it seemed only a step away, he just had to muster the courage and will to leave the damning thoughts behind. A warm hand on his shoulders jolted Ichigo from his rather depressing thoughts, and he tilted his head up to see a tangle of curly blonde locks followed by Rose's amethyst eyes. Beside him Shinji was regarding Ichigo warily, that fond yet blunt light in his eyes that warned Ichigo of an impending talk of doom. Times when Shinji decided that either Ichigo needed the shit beaten out of him while yelling at him, or he stared at Ichigo before in a calm deadly tone of steel declared some perception-altering phrase. Really, sometimes it was the smallest things he noticed and jolted Ichigo out of. The orange head would be grateful to the sarcastic blonde for a long time at least. A hand was in front of his face flapping wildly, and Ichigo chalked it up to sleep deprivation that he didn't slap it away and let himself get so lost in his thoughts as if wandering through a labyrinth where a misstep could lead to a minefield. "Got ya head in the clouds, Ichi?" Ichigo retaliated to Shinji's sharp and witty question with raised eyebrows and a small glare. That Cheshire smirk appeared as the blonde chuckled, and beside him Rose looked amused, fingers tapping some hidden rhythm on the pommel of his Zanpakuto. Shinji plopped beside him like a cat, albeit far less graceful than Yoriyuki, stretching out long limbs and watching his kin. Rose sat on the other side of Ichigo, boxing the young Shinigami in between the two blondes. Ichigo squashed the irrational fear at the feeling, instead settling into their familiar Reisu patterns, feeling the ebb and flow. Faintly he heard a sweet sonata lilting in Rose's Reisu and the contented purr of Sakanda and Shinji's. Around them the Vizard were gathered. Mashiro was flitting around Kensei, uncontainable energy bouncing from limb to limb, a bright smile chasing her features even as she toppled over into Kensei's lap. Kensei, startled, began nagging his lieutenant, stiff and grim even as fond light shone in his eyes. Hiyori was perched high on one of the spirals watching the proceedings. Ichigo suspected something to do with her height complex, and likely keeping an eye out for someone new to harass. Lisa was resting against Love, the two reading under the setting sun, content in a way readers only were in each other's presence. Haki was talking to Tessai, the two gesturing in small aborted movements, pointing every now and then in the vague direction of the labs. Kisuke exited one of the caves, a bottle of sake tucked under one arm and Ai Sosuke following beside him. Kami, he was never going to get used to calling him that, but Ichigo supposed it helped somewhat in erasing that haunting visage of the madman so closely associated with that name. It was like a new start. Sosuke was the one who had decided to change and see the future along a different path. The two settled down and they were complete, gathered together in a way Ichigo hadn't seen in a long while, and his heart ached. But it was a good ache, relief and happiness overwhelming the fear subjugated for the moment. "Ichigo?" Shinji asked quietly and seriously under his breath. Looking at him, Ichigo could see that charisma and natural aptitude for leadership shining through in the curve of his shoulders and determination of coffee-colored orbs. Ichigo responded, listening intently even as his eyes flickered around the group, noting their positions in an ingrained tactic of survival. Shinji demanded his attention with a slight flicker of Reisu. Ichigo looked into his eyes. We're family now, and any day we'd choose Ya over Soul Society. Understand? We got Ya back and we're damn well good at protecting ourselves. 'Cause sometimes a protector needs to share the burden. Ichigo stared in shock, uncomprehending, and he stuttered out before his brain could process, but you don't owe me anything. Shinji frowned for a moment before he considered Ichigo's amber orb's sincerity raging like an unkempt storm and said, we owe Ya our lives. But we wouldn't follow Ya for something like that. We follow you because here, at those words Shinji pointed to Ichigo's chest where his heart beat the drum of time, got me. Shinji finished, and Ichigo stared lost for a long time before Shinji shook his head in amusement and said, we follow Ya cause of Ya heart dumbass, it's in the right place, as much as Ya wanna wallow and hide in darkness we know better. With a wink the man stood up, flaunted his way over to Hiyori, that subtle aura gone in the face of his usual dramatics. Leaving a stunned Ichigo behind, he sat there for a long while, Rose's comforting presence beside him as he tried to process keen words and the fact that somehow once again he had managed to gain their loyalty. In the end his gaze swept around the training grounds, seeing his family, and he acknowledged that Shinji might be right, they were strong and would be strong enough for the future. Rose laughed at something Love tossed over his shoulder, and before Ichigo could question it Rose traded him a look, and Ichigo couldn't help but smile and then laugh as the humorous air becomes contagious. And Shinji was right, had always been right, they were family, they would protect each other and themselves. Check the description for the links to the author.